Newborn vampire Ruby Diaz is a rare and deadly being. Her raw power and smoldering darkness drawing the attention of Kaelith, the seductive and dangerous lord of the vampires. Thrust into this perilous new world, after a horrific accident, the once carefree Ruby finds herself inexplicably drawn to Kaelith's own inner turmoil and barely restrained intensity. Kaelith is a cold and imposing man, his piercing gaze and sensual, predatory grace captivating Ruby even as she senses the darkness that lurks within him. As Ruby struggles to master her newfound abilities, she must confront the notorious vampire cult known as the Shadows, a malicious group who seek to condemn all vampire and human souls to eternal damnation. With the fate of both the mortal and immortal realms resting on her shoulders, Ruby must decide who she can truly trust, the enigmatic and seductive Kaelith, or the few human survivors from her former life. In this treacherous world of blood and shadows, Ruby's very survival depends on unlocking the secrets of her own dark power before the shadows destroy them all. Book 1 of the Dark Blood Saga. Chapter 1. The red against white was a stark contrast, splashing against the styrofoam. For a moment, the sight of the cherry slush filling her cup gave Ruby the morbid thought of blood. Though on a night like tonight, she liked that comparison. Her mind sludged through the liquor she'd drunk, as she turned off the churning machine and turned, scanning the convenience store with wavering vision. Zareth leaned up against the counter, talking up the unfortunate cashier while slipping choco bars into his striped pants. The poor girl didn't notice a thing aside from his big brown eyes. He wore a ridiculous purple Joker suit with yellow pinstripes and green buttons. The jacket was open to reveal the yellow waistcoat and green tie that had "ha ha ha" scrawled all over it. There was a cane and hat that he'd worn with it, but they seemed to have disappeared as his mused dark brown hair lay exposed. And he'd skipped on the makeup Ruby had offered to do for him entirely. The suit, although ridiculous, accentuated his tall, lean figure nicely. And due to some amazing mixture of it all, the cashier was completely into him. Her ponytail bounced with each laugh, her tawny skin blushing under his heavy and alluring gaze. With a sigh, Ruby placed her cup on the counter and shot Zareth a pointed look as she handed the girl a 5. Zareth ignored her and went on to say something that made the cashier giggle and scatter Ruby's change all over the counter. She was quick to apologize and continue her conversation. "Zareth," Ruby said as she gathered up the fallen change, "they're here." He slid her a knowing look before giving the girl a big, charming smile. "I have to go." "Have a good Halloween, Jessica." "Maybe I'll see you?" Jessica asked, not nearly as casual as she'd probably intended. Zareth's grin grew. He winked, "Maybe." "Okay," Ruby said, rolling her eyes. She grabbed his arm and dragged him away from the counter. "What?" he asked innocently. She arched a brow at him, though from the never-wavering smile on his face, she could tell it wasn't near as stern as she'd hoped. "I literally can't take you anywhere." They pushed out the doors, the bells jingling as they went through, and Ruby received a rude reminder of the cool autumn breeze as gooseflesh rose on her legs. She'd worn a black baby doll dress with red ruffles, a black witch hat, and combat boots for the pre-Halloween party at Josh's, one of Zareth's friends who was even more infuriating. Though now she had absolutely no idea where her hat went and didn't care as she sipped from her cup. Lexi had helped her spray the ends of her black hair red, mainly for the purpose of her hair not blending into her outfit. "I just wanted to wish a fellow, beautiful girl a happy holiday." Ruby snorted and grinned despite herself. "Halloween isn't a holiday." "It isn't?" "Besides," he added, leaning forward with a wickedly charming grin, Life is too short to wait, Ruby." She rolled her eyes. He always got a kick out of using that phrase, even though they both knew he never truly had to wait for any girl to come crawling to him. Stumbling slightly, "Whatever. Do you see them?" "More like I hear them," he said, chuckling. Confused, Ruby looked at his amused expression and followed his gaze to a dark red convertible rumbling with music and laughter parked across the lot. She was shocked that she hadn't noticed it. Maybe she'd had more to drink than she'd thought. Just then a slim girl with dark brown skin, dressed as a green and yellow pixie, jumped up and, waving her arm wildly, cried, "Ruby." Ruby laughed and ran forward as childish giggles slipped from her. "You losers stole my hat," she yelled. The pixie, Lexi, waved the hat in the air like a flag. "Get in. We have to hurry." "Where are we going?" Zareth asked, already hopping in the back seat on the other side of Rex. Ruby handed her drink to Lexi before throwing her legs over the back door and sliding into the seat. Two girls, who she wasn't familiar with, sat squished in the front with Bo. Between gulps of Ruby's slush, Lexi said, "We're going to Red Zone." "And we have to make it by midnight," Rex added, as he stole the cup from Lexi. Ruby ignored the fact that her drink was being passed around, and her brows furrowed. "Red Zone." One of the girls, dressed as a cat in the front, turned around and splayed her tan hands on the seat. From the pink in her cheeks and the shine in her eyes, Ruby could tell she'd also drank. "Yeah, it is this deserted road in between these trees where—" "Hey, where are my cigs?" Bo yelled. "Here, buddy," Zareth said. He bent down to retrieve the fallen back beneath Bo's seat and passed it to him. The cat girl, who'd been interrupted, glared at Bo before turning back to Ruby with renewed vigor. "Anyways, it is this really dark and scary road. People have said that if you go on it at midnight that you can see a woman in white. Some say you can see blood on the road." The other girl, a pink Dixie chick with short red hair cut in. Her green eyes were heavy-lidded, and her speech a little too slow. Ruby got a whiff of the green rolling off of her. "Sadie," the cat girl hissed. The Dixie chick didn't even register that her friend had spoken, as her faraway gaze met Ruby's, or that you can hear screaming coming from nowhere. "Yeah," the cat girl said sharply, obviously irritated, "but it's supposedly really, really haunted." Ruby twirled a strand of hair over her finger, looking at the girl with intense confusion. She'd heard of Red Zone, and nothing she'd heard had been good. As if thinking the same thing, Zareth leaned forward and asked, "Isn't that the road that a lot of people have been run off on? And kidnapped?" Ruby added. Zareth glanced at her. It was a heavy kind of look, packed with a feeling she couldn't read. She felt the effects of Rex and Lexi flirtatiously and very drunkenly shoving each other as they too shoved her, but she didn't take her eyes off of the girl. Catgirl waved her hand. "Those are just stories." "And the hauntings aren't?" Zareth challenged, a gleam in his eyes. The girl opened her mouth to argue when Bo shifted gears and called, a lit cigarette hanging from his mouth, "Hang on, chickies, because tonight the moon is low and I am half-blind." A unanimous cheer rose from the group as he gunned it and shot out of the parking lot. Ruby had known Bo for a while from being in shot put together for years, but she'd never heard of him being blind. Still, she let out a wild laugh as the wind lifted the hair off of her shoulders and tossed her arms up with Lexi. She felt a warm hand bump hers and looked over, a bright smile on her face, to see Zareth giving her the same smile. For a short second, she saw him with sober eyes. Nearly black hair that usually fell across his forehead now flying back, a strong jawline, handsome brown eyes surrounded by unfairly thick lashes, and a sensual mouth. A mouth that disarmed every girl with a charming, slightly tilted grin. Ruby was no different. Every time he smiled at her, that smile worked the same charms on her with its obvious confidence. But she knew Zareth in ways no other girls, or even guys, did. And she'd never let herself fall for that damned smile, nor for his smooth pickup lines. Though she was unashamed to admit that she admired him from afar, Ruby knew her place though, and she knew that she'd rather have him as her closest friend than to be another notch in his belt. So she bumped his hand back and stuck out her tongue. As they drove, Rex and Zareth made sure to tease Bo for the way the moon was, in fact, entirely full. "You all are lying. It's literally reflecting off of your bald ass. What do you mean?" Rex yelled. Everyone laughed, except for the Dixie chick who had completely checked out from the present and stared blankly across the road, as Bo ran a hand over the smooth brown skin of his head. He shook his head. "I'll show you the moon, and I promise." "Look," the cat girl cried. Everyone went silent and followed where she pointed to a tall white road sign reading, "You are now entering red zone. Proceed with caution." Lexi gasped, "There's blood on it." Rex smacked his lips. "Baby, that's fake." "Yeah," Ruby added, "just a joke for Halloween." However, her stomach had plummeted 10 feet at the sight. She scanned the shadows, and her blood ran cold. Something was very wrong. Chapter 2. An eerie silence fell over the group as Bo slowed. With exaggeration, he reclined in his seat and flung a casual arm over the seat behind Catgirl, who was leaning against Dixie Chick. Goosebumps rose on Ruby's arms. All around them were pitch-dark trees. Those woods are thick, she thought. Anybody could be hiding in the shadows, waiting to scare them. Nothing would happen, she determined. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she nodded to herself and promised to be brave. Bo started fiddling with his phone, and finding whatever he'd been looking for, turned up the stereo to play Monster Mash. "Come on," Lexi groaned. "That is so lame," Catgirl added. "I think it fits the mood," Bo said. "What do you think, boys?" "Oh yeah. Maybe we'll see that ghost chick boogieing to it," Rex said. Lexi nudged him in the side with a laugh. All sense of humor was lost on Ruby. She was now completely sober and saw the road with sharpened clarity. Her crimson nails, which had been filed into sharp stilettos, scraped against the window button. She wanted Bo to put the roof back on, and for all the windows to roll up, though she knew she'd been laughed out of the country if she admitted that out loud. But it wasn't ghosts or demons she was scared of. It was the stories of kids just like them being forced off of the road and then kidnapped, taken to God knows where. Ruby didn't want to know. Her fists furled and unfurled in her rising anxiety. They were the perfect target, just a bunch of drunk and niave 20-somethings looking for a thrill. Despite the chatter in the car and Bo's cheesy Halloween music, the road was silent. She heard the stretch of leather as Zareth leaned over Rex and Lexi, who were talking amongst themselves, to say, "If Bo passes out, I call dibs on taking his car." "Then I call dibs on the car keys," Ruby said, a challenging grin on her face. Zareth's tan skin stretched with his own smile. "As if I was going to leave you behind." She rolled her eyes. "Not even for Jessica?" she asked mockingly, drawing out the girl's name. "Who?" Ruby shoved him, and he caught her hand with a laugh. For a second her gaze settled on the contrast of his naturally bronze skin against her tan. As if he'd absorbed the sun itself, his touch was hot and sent even warmer sensations through her core. Catching herself, she tore from his grip, but Zareth wasn't paying attention anymore as he talked with Rex. With a sigh, Lexi laid her head on Ruby's shoulder, the latter patting the girl's head with her own sigh. "Nothing is even happening," Lexi grumbled. Catgirl sent back a displeased look, before saying something to Bo. "Oh, are you bored?" he asked. Before anyone could respond, the headlights went out. A crowd of cries rose up. Ruby shot forward. "Hey!" she yelled. "Turn the lights back on." Bo only laughed, ignoring their alarm. "Chill out, girl." "She's right, Bo," Zareth said firmly. Ruby felt a twinge of surprise as she looked at him. Cast in the faint glow of the moonlight, his expression was hard. She wasn't sure of the last time she'd seen him so serious. Was it when David had tried to lay one on her without her permission, or when a football player from their rival school had shoved him? Ruby shook her head and the thoughts away. High school felt like a million years ago. The darkness was crowding in on them, and she felt it like a living thing as it whipped her hair back with its violent winds. Bo didn't turn on the lights, even as they begged him to. No, instead he hooted and stepped harder on the gas. Lexi's nails dug into Ruby's arm. There were panicked shouts. Everything that happened after felt surreal. "Slow down," Rex called. Catgirl was tugging on Bo's shoulder. "Please," she cried, "please." Bo wasn't listening. His knuckles tightened on the wheel, and he pressed down harder on the gas. "Come at me now, ghosts." "This isn't funny," Lexi said. Her words were lost in the wind before they could reach him. Everyone seemed to realize then that he wasn't going to stop, and a moment of terror-filled silence took over them. Ruby clung to Lexi, who now clung to Rex. The air whipped past their ears, mimicking screams. For a moment, she believed that the car was shaking and panicked. But it was only her. Zareth shot her a quick glance. Time felt like it froze with that glance, as Ruby had read all of the fear and anger in it. The love and determination. Suddenly, she was back at Cryer's Creek, nearly 10 feet in the air with him right beside her. Then time was rocketing forward with horrifying speed, and Zareth was lunging over the seat towards Bo, where they wrestled to turn on the lights. The car swerved. Catgirl screamed. "Let go." Bo barked. "Turn on the lights," Zareth said. The Catgirl cried, "You are going to kill us." "Stop freaking out," Bo said, now angry. He was more inebriated than Ruby had known. Like a bucket of ice water, cold rushed through her. They were going to die. Her eyes shot to Zareth, standing up in his seat. If Bo shoved too hard, he would fall out. Ruby jumped forward to grab Zareth's arm, ready to yank him back and hold him close until it was all over, when she saw Catgirl. The girl's eyes were squinted as she peered through the windshield. "What is?" She sucked in a sharp, high-whistled breath, and her eyes flew wide. Ruby never got to hear what the girl cried, as the car slammed into something as hard as stone. Chapter 3. All she heard was the high keening sound of metal twisting and screams. So much screaming. Ruby's body was hit and shoved this way and that before she slammed into something hard. Rocks dug into her skin. Then something was sliding into her gut. She cried out, a choked and pitched sound as it tore through flesh, bone, and organ. She didn't stop screaming even as the blade stopped moving, and blood filled her throat. Ruby blacked out. When she woke, the screaming had stopped. All was quiet. The faint glow of headlights revealed the treetops to her. She took a deep, wheezing breath and coughed. Blood splattered on her face, gushing over her lips. The pain she'd felt was now, at most, a memory. Her legs shook, her right slightly bouncing off of the ground. Her body was in shock. Zareth, she thought, where's Zareth? Her mind was a mess. All she wanted to do was fall into the deep darkness tugging at her. But now that that single name had crossed her thoughts, she couldn't fall asleep. She had to find him. To find him and Lexi and Rex and Bo. She lifted her head and saw, with sobering horror, that a large chunk of metal cut halfway through her gut. A choked sob escaped her. There was so much blood. It coated her entire body and the road around her. She saw the bodies then. The Dixie chick was mere feet from her, lying face down and motionless. The upper half of Catgirl's body was slung over the hood of the car, through the windshield. Blood covered her face. Bo lay directly in front of the car. Lexi and Rex were thrown like dolls in the front seats. Dead. All of them. The car itself was twisted and folded in impossible ways, with some of the doors open wide. Chunks of metal were strewn around them. Another sob slipped from her, and her trembling arms gave out. She fell back against the cement. She hadn't seen Zareth anywhere. Zareth, she wheezed, coughing. No answer came. Suddenly Ruby's thoughts cut off, and she stared up at the night sky with blank eyes. She couldn't think, couldn't feel. It was all too much. Dead. All of her friends. She saw Lexi standing behind her, winding her slender fingers through Ruby's hair as music blared in the background. They'd been having sleepovers since they were 12, laughing and dancing. Fighting over stupid things, but eventually, always, coming back together. Ruby and Lexi had met Rex after Zareth made friends with him junior year. The four of them had been by the lake, jumping over rocks and messing around. Lexi and Rex begun dating not too long after. And Bo, Ruby had known him nearly as long as she had Zareth. It was only because of Track that they'd gotten to know each other better. He was impulsive, wild, and hilarious. Had always been a weird one. But still, he'd been her friend. However, it was Zareth who was closest to her heart. Known around school as the womanizer, the player. But to her he was just Zareth, the kid with chubby cheeks who always somehow knew the moment she was home and would run out to play with her. The kid who'd grown into a man who charmed everyone he met. Extroverted and popular. His status had inevitably helped her status as well. Although, Ruby wouldn't care if he'd never been popular. If he'd never grown out of his baby fat. She still would have loved him. She would have continued spending nights with him, as they watched their favorite shows and argued about the stupidest things. She still would have let him make her laugh, and fall deeper for him, even if she couldn't have him. Warm tears fell over her cheeks. He isn't dead. She refused to believe it. Science could work miracles. Maybe she'd be able to hear Lexi's laugh, have Rex help with her homework, to curse Bo out for being an idiot. And maybe she'd be able to get to know Catgirl and Dixie Chick. After all of that, maybe she'd be able to hold Zareth in her arms and cry. Voices rose on the edge of her awareness. Shadows were growing in her vision. Her body growing numb, as if she felt it from a distance. Looks like they were here, an unfamiliar voice said from somewhere down the road. We were too late, said another. Wait, one said, 2 hearts are beating. 2. Zareth. Warm relief rushed through her. She had no idea who these people were, or how they knew that their hearts were beating. But Ruby was delirious, and ready to believe anything if it meant Zareth lived. A man's face appeared above her. Impassively he called to his companions, Here's one. The other is here, through the windshield. What? No. Zareth wasn't through the windshield. They had it wrong. The man leaned down closer to her and said, I'm going to give you 2 choices. This time he was talking to her. 1, I will make sure you die quick and painlessly. Or 2, you live as one of the undead. Ruby's brows furrowed, and she tried to speak but ended up choking on more blood. I can't save you as you are. Your injuries are too deep. Your life as a human is over either way you choose, but this way the end won't be painful. She didn't understand anything of what he was saying, except for the basics. Live or die. Ruby knew she'd die soon. She could feel the tug of the darkness growing. If she followed it, where would she go? Would a girl like her find peace? Later, Ruby would regret her decision. A choice made in a state of such delirium and desperation, it deprived her of all rational thought. Survive, she thought, survive and save Zareth. This man, maybe he was a miracle worker. Right now, a miracle was exactly what she needed. Her wet lips parted, and with a breathy croak, she answered, "Live." Chapter 4. The man bit her. He gave no warning. The moment the word had left her lips, he smiled to reveal two incredibly sharp canines and brought them to her throat in a swift movement. In the split second before he bit, Ruby believed the fangs to be a part of a Halloween costume. Like the bag of plastic teeth that she'd bought the year before from the dollar store. Some were green, some yellow, but some were white like his. But then they pierced the skin of her neck, and a hot pain shot from them through her body. Her mouth fell open in a silent scream. It hurt. It burned, and it hurt. She felt her blood being pulled effortlessly from her, and knew in that moment that everything she'd ever been told was a lie. Monsters were real. She tensed, wishing she could drag what he was stealing from her back inside. It's mine, she thought in wild anger and terror. His hands grasped her shoulders to still her, as violent tremors raced through her. In the vampire's vice-like grip, Ruby believed he was going to kill her. That his talk of saving her had all been an act. She stared up at the sky, her body stiff and shaking as he stole all life from her. Miracles don't exist, and she'd somehow given this demon permission to kill her. It wasn't long before she felt the sting of his fangs pulling out of her. Maybe he'd bitten her for 30 seconds. Maybe he'd bitten her for an hour. She had no way of knowing, as her vision swam and her ears rang. Her entire body shook. Warm liquid was thrust against her mouth. Ruby tried to spit it out. The man grabbed the back of her head and shoved her hard against his arm. "Drink," he ordered. "If you wish to live, then drink." A sob escaped her. Feeling the rush of tears over her cheeks, Ruby opened her mouth and drank. It was disgusting. What the hell is happening? It was all too much, too morbid. She thought of the bodies lying around her. All of their blood. But his was warm. She hadn't known just how cold she'd become until she was swallowing the thick, metallic liquid. She gagged many times, and the taste never got better. However, her craving for warmth, to be warm, became overpowering. She grabbed his arm fiercely and gulped the liquid heat down. Her mind went blank, all of her focus narrowed in on the red gushing into her. "Okay, that's enough," he said, easily prying her nails from his arm and moving away. Ruby's head fell back. She sucked on the tips of her nails, reveling in how they matched the color of his blood. Her eyes drooped. "Don't fight it. Fall asleep, and when you wake, you will be made new." She didn't know what he meant, but she listened. Lying in a pool of her own blood, surrounded by the bodies of her friends, Ruby died all alone with her heart yearning for something better. Chapter 5. Ruby was just walking up her drive when Zareth suddenly bounded out of his house and right to her. She noticed his bike lying directly in front of his porch, as if he'd thrown it down the moment he'd gotten home and bolted inside to game. "Hey," he said, "what's wrong?" His face was round and chubby, and though he was still a foot shorter than her, Ruby had noticed him starting to grow and slim out over the summer. Her grandma had said it had something to do with puberty. She shook her head, attempting her best smile. Nothing. Come on, he said, tell me. Okay, she sighed, gripping her bag straps tightly. A part of her had wanted to tell him anyway. Some people were making fun of me for not having kissed anyone yet. His face scrunched, and his already dark eyes went darker. Who? It doesn't matter, Zareth. Tell me who, Ruby. Louisa, John, Beau, and Elizabeth. Zareth scoffed. First of all, John and Beau are only agreeing with whatever their girlfriends say, so don't listen to them. And second of all, Louisa and Elizabeth have no room to speak. They just had their firsts last week. Ruby's brows drew together. Still, they made sure everyone heard. Zareth fell silent, watching her. There was anger lining his features, as there always was when Louisa or Elizabeth bothered her, but he appeared more contemplative than anything else. Then after a moment he smiled and said, "Would it help if you got your first over with?" Ruby thought about this. If it wasn't for Louisa and Elizabeth teasing her, then she wouldn't even be worried about it, and in truth, she wasn't. The idea of her lips touching someone else's sounded disgusting, especially when every boy in the 6th grade was gross and picked their noses. But there was a curiosity that the girls had sparked inside of her at the prospect of doing that with a cute boy. Why did couples do it so much in the movies? There had to be a reason for it. Was there a spark of electricity during it? She decided she wanted to know. Nodding, she said, "Yeah, I think so." "Okay," he said. With a shrug, Zareth began to walk towards Cryer's Creek. "Where are you going?" He turned, his brows scrunched in confusion, to our hideout. "For our kiss." "What?" Ruby reared back, heart suddenly racing in her chest. "I'm not kissing you." "Really, Ruby? Tell me, what other boys do you feel comfortable enough to even speak to?" "That's different. You're my best friend." "Exactly, so we'll just get it over with and go on with our lives." Her lips pressed tight and she watched him. He had a point. Ruby was the most comfortable with him. She'd jump and roll around in the mud with him. She'd changed shirts once in front of him in a pinch, and though she didn't have anything to show in the first place, he'd never made her feel uncomfortable. They'd grown up with each other. "Okay," she said finally, "let's get it over with. But I swear if Ma finds out and kills me, I'm going to haunt you." Mary would have a heart attack if she knew half of things him and his friends did around town. And if she knew Ruby and him were kissing behind her back, well, they'd both probably die. His only response was to give her a grin that would soon become a trademark for him. It was the smile that would end up winning him many hearts, even hers later on. A troublemaker's grin. They trudged their usual path to the creek. It was only a yard or so from their houses, but the entrance had become so overgrown that no one ever used it. No one but them. It was a shame, too, because the creek was the place where they had the most fun. But they wouldn't tell anyone about it, because it was theirs. Years of jumping over the stream, kicking dirty water at each other, or playing hide-and-go-seek in the overgrowth was for them and them alone. After marching through the grass, they reached the creek. One tree had a branch low enough that they'd tied 2 pieces of rope to, along with a long wooden plank between those to make their own swing. Both of them had had plenty of experience being both shoved off of it and being the shover. Zareth grabbed one of the ropes and with a loud oomph hopped up onto the swing. It tended to take multiple tries for them to get on it, and by luck he made it his first try. Giving her a cocky grin, he held out his hand. While he was chubbier and shorter than her, Zareth had always been stronger from long days working with his abuelito. Ruby took his hand and let herself be hauled up onto the spot beside him. She was quick to grab her corresponding rope before falling over the other side, and soon they were swinging softly. Beneath them, there was the gentle trickling of water from a river nearby. Sunlight broke through the treetops and danced in glittering rays over the creek. It was dirty and disgusting water, but in the light it was beautiful. "So," he said, making her heart suddenly speed tenfold. She hadn't realized how nerve-wracking it would be to kiss him, and was now very grateful she was doing it with him rather than a boy she didn't know. "So," she repeated. Zareth turned to look at her, and that split moment before he kissed her would stick in her mind for years. Sunlight cascading over his halo of black curls, his face round and bronze. His black eyes crinkled as he smiled. Slowly, he leaned in and touched his lips to hers. It was only a quick peck, but at her age it was a lot. His lips had felt soft and cool, but there had been no spark. Nothing exciting that could explain why adults, or even the upperclassmen, would do it so often. She'd been nervous for nothing. Still, she'd thanked him, and afterwards they'd shared smiles and talked about the upcoming dance. By the time he was helping her off the swing, and they were racing against the setting sun to get home, they'd forgotten all about it. Ruby would remember that moment for years after, and the older she got, the more it made her smile. Once they'd been in the throes of hormones and freshman year, Ruby had felt drastically different about boys and kissing. And she'd notice how Zareth's features would define and become handsome enough to give her confusing thoughts. By 15, she'd wish she could kiss him again. Chapter 6. The room Ruby woke up in was cold. The walls were stark white. It was a small room with a sturdy metal door directly in front of her feet. She groaned, her head pounding as she pushed up to her elbows. She was lying on a morgue tray. Ruby's blood went cold, her heart dropping. Why was she on a morgue tray? Was she in a morgue? Her eyes shot to the door. Was she about to give a morgue worker a heart attack? At that point, she hadn't so much as turned her head, so when someone's breath hitched from beside her, Ruby jumped. It was Catgirl. Her blue eyes were bouncing wildly from corner to corner, her chest rising and falling quickly. The black shirt and poofed skirt she'd worn were torn and bloodied, one of her feet bare of a heel, and her charcoal face makeup smeared with crimson. Those wide eyes found Ruby. "You?" she croaked. Ruby's heart sunk. "It's just us," she said, more to herself. The room was only big enough for them. Her eyes filled with sudden tears, and the girl shoved herself up with surprising ferocity. What the hell happened? Where is everyone? Where are we? She didn't know. Ruby's lips twisted. She had no idea how to explain to the girl what happened. She barely knew herself. It was impossible for Ruby to wrap her head around. Curiosity sparked, and Ruby glanced down at her stomach. The fabric of her dress was torn and bloodied, but there was no metal jutting from her. "I don't know." The Catgirl was hyperventilating. "I feel weird. Why am I not injured? Weren't we in a car crash? Where is Sadie?" The door to the room tore open then, and 3 different men entered. Ruby and the girl immediately shot back on their tables and closer to each other. The man in the lead was the one who had changed her, but the other 2 were unfamiliar to her. The vampire she knew, he had to be in his 30s with shaggy blonde hair, smiled at them and said, "Good morning, ladies." "Who are you?" Catgirl huffed, "Where is Sadie?" Ruby's heart squeezed painfully as the image of the Dixie Chick's dead body raced through her mind. The man didn't have any qualms though, as he said, "All of your friends are dead." Catgirl's eyes went wide. The tears poured over then. Ruby whirled on the man, There were no other survivors. Please, she thought, please don't be dead. None. Everything crashed down. Or at least, that's how it felt as the air escaped her. Zareth was dead. Zareth. Her Zareth. And Lexi and Rex. And even Beau. Stupid, stupid Beau, who caused this by driving like an idiot, but whom she still had cared for. And then there was Sadie. Someone she didn't know and who she had never spoken to, but who Catgirl had obviously loved. They were all dead. Ruby's own eyes stung. She wouldn't cry. She blinked and took deep breaths until they were gone. Focusing on the fact that they were now surrounded by 3 strange men, or vampires, she shoved all thoughts of her friends away. Focus, she told herself, focus on the fangs. It was easier said than done when Catgirl was sobbing beside her. Now that that is out of the way, said the man coldly, it is now time to introduce you both to vampire society. Vampire? Catgirl asked, choking on her tears. Yes, he said. When he smiled, his fangs were made even more menacing in the sharp lights. Catgirl inhaled sharply, and the sound was too similar to the one she'd made just before they crashed, that Ruby was forced to calm herself all over again. She started shaking. So you see, you both are vampires now. I saved your lives, so now please do me the honor of helping me stick to my schedule so I don't lose my head. Ruby's gut churned. Can you give us a minute? We just woke up. Yes, and your fangs aren't in yet. You don't have a minute. If we don't hurry along, both of you will drop dead. What? Why? He let out a long sigh. I don't have time for this. Bring them. He snapped his fingers and walked out of the room. With that single command, one of the vampires lunged for her. Chapter 7. The path towards Deacon's Road, or also known as Red Zone by the kids around town, was a bumpy one. Made worse by the neck-breaking speed required of the ambulance. When you get a call that a group of kids had been in a fatal car crash on the infamous road, there was no time to waste. Especially when there were only stretches of back roads to reach it from the hospital. Do you know how many? Mary asked. She had a death grip on the rail, facing the ambulance doors so she could burst through the moment the vehicle parked. Finn shook his head, about 5 or 6. She released a shaky breath. Please, not them, Lord, she prayed. Not her son. The ambulance screeched to a halt, and with a sharp tap from Leo in the front, Finn shoved open the doors and together he and Mary rushed out. There were cops and detectives already on the scene. A gray pickup truck was pulled over to one side, talking emphatically with the detective. On the other side of the road lay the mangled convertible with bodies strewn around it. Dear God, Mary said under her breath. She took in the bodies, the blood. Then snapping back to herself, she rushed to the head of forensics. Sir, what is the report? Any survivors? He shook his head grimly. No. All of them seemed to have died, either on impact or shortly after. What are their names? He snapped his fingers at a police officer standing nearby, who hurried over instantly. Read her off the names. Yes, sir, the cop said. Taking out his pad, he began. Sadie Discart, Alexi Harford, Rex Flynn, and Beauregard Carter. Mary's eyes were wide. She jerked. There are no others. Hadn't Zareth told her that Ruby and him would be hanging out with Beau and Rex? The officer shook his head, not at the scene. But their last known location was at a gas station down the road. The security footage showed 2 girls and a boy with the group that aren't here now. We won't know if they were here or not until the results of the DNA samples come back, said the head of forensics, Greg. No, Mary breathed. She could only guess as to who the boy was and the girl with him. Zareth, Ruby, and possibly one of Ruby's friends. She shook her head sharply. They must have gotten off. Zareth wouldn't have come here, not with all of the accident reports. Greg shrugged. We have men searching the area. He said something to the officer before walking away without another word to Mary. Don't worry, ma'am, the officer said, noticing the way she fiddled with her sleeves. I'm sure if they aren't here that they are okay. Just do your job and find them. Please. He nodded before leaving her to stand there. Mary took deep breaths as she joined Finn in checking all of the victims' pulses. Then, deciding that they were truly dead, Leo called for more assistance and they began bagging the bodies. It was a gruesome job, and Mary hated to see the glazed-over eyes. She especially hated seeing those eyes on kids. They were all around Zareth and Ruby's age, at the peak in their life. Time raced by as they worked. At some point, more medics joined them to put the bodies in the back of their ambulances. By the end, Mary's arms shook and her back ached. Sadly, she was used to this. Coming to Red Zone to attend to survivors or the dead of another tragic accident. Over here. I found one. Mary froze. Then another voice cried out, I need a medic. Zareth. She shot forward, diving down the ditch and straight through the trees. She heard other medics behind her as she stumbled towards the swinging flashlights of the officers. They were talking, and between them someone was coughing. When Mary reached them, it took a long moment for her eyes to adjust to what she saw. Zareth, lying on the ground, covered in blood and clutching his arm. Blood raced from his forehead and coated his sleeve. But his eyes were open, and he was aware. Zareth, she cried. Mary fell to her knees beside him. His dark eyes tracked on her just before she grabbed his shoulders. Ma. Oh, I'm here, mijo, I'm here. A broken sob escaped him. She could see the fear in his eyes. It was there, in every survivor's eyes. But when he opened his mouth, she realized he wasn't scared for himself. Where's Ruby? He croaked. Mary's heart stuttered. She hesitated to answer, and in that moment, arms lifted her away from him, and Finn's face came into view. I need you to stay out of the way, Mary. Let us help him. But you will only get in the way, he said, giving her a pointed look. She nodded, barely breathing, and watched as they helped him. Mary knew the fight to keep families back from their loved ones, and though she wanted to fight and scream, she knew better. So she stood and watched, shaking with helplessness and relief. But her heart sank. Where was Ruby? Glancing around the dark woods, as if that might show her the path to Ruby, a new kind of fear rose in her. Ruby was like her own daughter. She'd handle the girl's death as well as she'd handle Zareth's. Ever since she moved in with her grandparents next door, after her parents' death, she'd also moved into Mary's heart. They were able to wrap Zareth's wounds and lift him on a gurney. Leo and Finn carried the gurney through the trees and up to the ambulance. One empty of dead bodies waited for him. Zareth's head was shooting around, his wild eyes searching. He flinched at the sight of the car, and then the blood. But there was only one name on his lips. Ruby, he mumbled. Where is Ruby? As they passed the side of the car, with a giant chunk of bloodied metal lying on the ground, Zareth shot up right and off of the gurney, as if that chunk of metal was Ruby herself. Zareth! Mary cried. The other medics were scrambling to get him to stop, but he slipped from their grasps. He half limped, half ran to the metal and fell to his knees. The detectives and officers and medics froze, all watching as he lifted a single silver ring. His breath caught. Tentatively, the head of forensics approached him. Bending down to Zareth's level, he asked, "Whose ring is that?" "It's Ruby's," Zareth said without hesitation. He looked up at the man then, and tears streaked down his face. "Where is she? I need to see her." Greg looked up to Mary, his lips set in a grim line, and gave a small nod as if saying, "This is all yours." Zareth caught the look, and his eyes fell on her, expectant. Mary's heart squeezed. "We don't know," she said softly, "but we will find her, Amor, I promise." His jaw went tight, and he said with all of the authority of the man before him, rather than a broken, bloodied boy, "Yes, we will." "No. No," she wanted to say. She wanted to demand he stayed in bed, in her house, for the rest of his life. But he was way past old enough to do as he wished, and Mary would never keep him from helping his best friend. Besides, she wanted Ruby found too. With a fire in his eyes and a determined set to his jaw, Zareth limped, half sagging, back to the gurney. Chapter 8. Snatching her arm, he tore her roughly off of the table. Ruby let out a cry of surprise as her knee banged against the floor. She fought his impossibly strong grip and saw Catgirl doing the same. "Let me go," the girl cried. Ruby could barely keep her legs beneath her. Gravity and the weight of her own body felt suddenly foreign, and the vampire half walked her, half dragged her out of the door and into a long, dark hall. The change of lighting was so drastic that she had to blink to adjust to the darkness, but when she did, Ruby saw everything. There were no shadows, no corners she couldn't see through. Her foot caught, and she stumbled forward. The vampire yanked her up so sharply that she yelped. Then, gritting her teeth, Ruby snapped, "Slow down." He ignored her, and she continued to stumble and be jerked around. Her arm quickly grew sore. Tears choked her throat, and a deep misery dropped inside of her like an anchor, dragging her down into the dark depths of the ocean. Catgirl was pounding her fists against her vampire, sinking her blunt teeth into his hand, but he didn't even flinch. It was as if their holders had no minds of their own to think with, as if they were merely shells to be commanded. It didn't matter how much either of the girls fought, as the vampires didn't budge. They were dragged through countless corridors and upstairs. Eventually, Ruby gave up her fight and instead focused on her surroundings to ground herself. The floors were covered in dark red runners, the walls made of even darker wood. The arched ceiling was immaculate, with similarly curved windows that lorded over them. Soon, she was aware that they were inside a mansion. Their captors wore expensive suits. Her brow scrunched. The other vampire had been wearing one too. Were they dressed up for Halloween, parading their fangs around as a costume and saving random girls? Finally, they stopped at a set of towering, elaborately carved wooden doors. By now, Ruby's knees were red and burning, her arm sockets screaming in pain. The one holding her raised his fist and knocked with the wolf's head knocker. Soon, a deep voice said from within, "Enter." The vampires shoved through the doors. Ruby didn't have time to take in where they entered when the vampires tossed her and the other girl to the floor. Her already sore knees hit the carpet. She whirled, now fuming to see the vampires already gone. She'd asked to live, to survive, not to be treated like trash. "Maybe you shouldn't have survived at all," a voice whispered inside of her. She winced and thought of Zareth, lying dead and cold on a deserted road. Without her. "Rise," a deep voice said. Ruby turned, finding herself looking up at the vampire. It was a man, not much older than them, towering over them. He radiated power. With warm bronze skin, black hair cut short on the sides and sculpted on top. There were random thin strips of gray strewn throughout. The latter color confused her. Like the others, he wore elegant clothes. A plum-colored velvet tuxedo jacket over black dress clothes. Ruby and the girl moved to their feet without argument, both feeling the weight of his hazel eyes. Even from the distance she was at, Ruby picked out the spots of green and gold against the storm gray of his irises. It was as if her eyes were a camera, able to zoom on command. He was beautiful and terrifying. A man, no vampire, clearly in a lot of power. "What are your names?" he asked. "Hallie," Catgirl started shakily, "and this is Ruby." Ruby only nodded. It felt like everything was hitting her at once. The fear, the anger, and the sadness. A sadness so deep and dark, if she allowed herself to explore it, she might never escape from its icy grasp. Tremors were rocking through her. The vampire's hazel eyes landed on her. She forced her chin up, her expression neutral. "Both of you have been given a blessing. A second chance. I suggest you use it wisely." Hallie shook her head. "What can you explain what is happening to me?" The man's nostrils flared, and for a moment he was silent, eyeing Hallie as his features slowly darkened. "Jeffrey." The door swung open almost immediately, and the vampire who had turned Ruby strolled in. His own face was hard, and he stopped only feet before her to stand at attention. "Sire?" Jeffrey asked. The hazel-eyed vampire jerked his chin toward Hallie. "Why is she so confused? Was she not awake when you and your men turned her?" "What?" Ruby quickly shot Hallie a look, and the girl clamped her lips shut. This was a time to be quiet. She would not regain consciousness, sire. So she turned without consent. Jeffrey's jaw ticked. "Yes, sire." "Who is her maker, Jeffrey?" Jeffrey shifted, as if hesitating. The other vampire noticed this, and stood tall, now lording over Jeffrey. "Tell me, and I will let you go unpunished." Ruby tried to hold herself still. Her heart raced as she watched the two vampires. Jeffrey wasn't nearly as terrifying, with the other one standing over him. "Tell him," a part of her urged. She didn't want to see what the other vampire would do to him if Jeffrey didn't speak. Thankfully, she wouldn't have to. Jeffrey bowed his head and said, "Ramuel, sire." The other vampire's gaze grew dark, his voice darker. "Go. Bring him to me." "Yes, yes, sire," Jeffrey said, and made a quick exit. That dark gaze found the girls, and both took an involuntary step back. Chapter 9. If he noticed their reaction, he didn't show it, for he moved back to his spot before the desk and sat on it, watching them. There was no softness to him. He was all hard edges. Ruby couldn't deny that he was handsome, more so than she had expected. And the streaks of his hair intrigued her. Was it dyed or caused by an accident? His voice, deep and rough, cut through her line of thought like a silver blade. "You are in transition to be vampires now, saved from the brink of death, and offered a second chance at life. You will be stronger, faster, and stealthier than you were before. Dangerous. Under my tutelage, and with my guidance, you will become the most feared girls alive. But you will also learn control, restraint. I will not tolerate unnecessary deaths, nor will I tolerate my orders ignored." Hallie's face had gone white with every word he spoke, and now, with a shaking hand, she felt inside her mouth. "You do not have your fangs yet, because you have not fed. If you do not drink blood within the hour, you will die. If you do, then," his lips lifted in a jarring smile, "welcome home." Home. The word was resounding in Ruby's gut. Home was a place of white walls and sunshine. It was her grandma's white hair, her grandpa's gentle smile. It was Zurith's warm arms around her, and Mary's muttered prayers. It wasn't this place. This darkness. It wasn't this man, before her, radiating power and cruelty. It wasn't being dragged through halls and treated as trash, or calling someone sire. No. This wasn't her home, and she'd make sure she returned to her real one. For now, though, she was stuck with a cold burrow deep inside of her, and a burning in her chest, her throat, that had come on the moment he'd said blood. "What if I don't want to drink blood?" Ruby asked. Her voice came out stronger than she felt. His eyes slid to her, and she felt as if they were pulling her apart, striping her bare to see all the things she wasn't saying. She didn't like it. She already felt out of sorts, and her strength was draining from the energy it took just to keep her thoughts at bay. "Then you will die. It isn't my place to stop you. But don't forget, you are the one who chose this." "I didn't have a choice," Hallie said quickly, as if she couldn't quite catch her breath. "Yes," he said flatly, "and I'm about to handle that." Ruby and Hallie shared a look, the latter's eyes wide with fear. Ruby fiddled with the bracelet around her wrist. An intricate twine of yellow and green yarn that Lexi and she had made. The one she wore was of Lexi's favorite colors, woven by her own slender hands, while on Lexi's wrist was one of the exact same pattern in red and black. A way to remember each other by. Now, though, Ruby realized with a pang, Lexi would be buried with it while Ruby lived. Forced to stare at the bracelet and imagine Lexi's ghostly fingers weaving it together. With a jolt, Ruby jerked her hand from the bracelet. Her eyes were burning, and the pain in her throat was nothing to the ice-cold blade that sat in her heart. That blade had landed there the moment her maker had revealed that everyone, all of her friends, were dead, and it only continued to twist and drive deeper into her. Breathing deeply, she forced herself to focus. Focus, focus, focus. Or else her mind would wander again, and she was sure that if it did, she wouldn't be able to hold it together. He stood and waved a dismissive hand at them. "Leave. Guards will lead you to the feeding room, and it will be your choice to turn." He was already turning away, striding towards two heavy red curtains that led to somewhere Ruby couldn't see. Suddenly, her mind cleared with the insult of his dismissal. "Excuse me," she blurted, none too kindly. He froze. Slowly, he turned just enough to look at her. Though his expression remained the same, she could see some of the ire her tone created in his eyes. "Yes. You're just going to leave. We don't even know anything about being vampires. Do we burn in the sun? How often do we need to feed? What has changed?" "That," he said sharply, "will all be discussed tomorrow morning after you two have made your decisions, and we've all gotten rest." He turned towards her fully then, and Ruby nearly cringed at the sheer power of him. "Is that all?" She clenched her fist but only said, "Yes." He jerked his chin in a short nod before disappearing through the curtains. As if on cue, the room doors opened and the vampires who dragged them to the room strolled in. This time, they didn't touch the girls, only waited for them. Ruby shot a nervous glance at Hallie, but the girl wasn't looking. They followed the guards through the halls. The more they walked, the more wobbly Ruby felt. "Hold it together," she begged hopelessly. Her belly ached for warm, red liquid. She'd never tasted it before, but suddenly it was all she could think about. She became hyper-aware of Hallie walking beside her, of the many arteries running through the girl's body. Something in her was dark. It felt like a yawning chasm. A place that, if she tripped and fell into, she'd never escape. It was a cold, cold place. Maybe it was her grief. It felt darker. She could feel it as they walked. Wind swept up from it, brushing along her nerve endings. Part of her wanted to fall in. The other part felt a sharp, jolting horror at the thought. Ruby made herself count the steps they took. She wished she could say it was to track where they went or something clever, but it was only to keep herself present when the memory of the car crash continuously fought to return. The sounds of laughter and conversation floated towards them. Hallie moved closer, her arm brushing Ruby's. She might not know the blonde girl, but right now she was all Ruby had. And she realized she was all Hallie had. They turned into the opening of a ballroom, with shiny oak floors and crimson wallpaper. The ceiling curved into a dome, and despite the large chandelier hanging down the middle, the room was dim. In the room, sitting at the long, dark wood tables, were many vampires. As if hearing Ruby's beating heart or Hallie's sharp intake of breath, nearly all of the vampires whirled towards them. Ruby snatched up Hallie's hand. Their guards didn't move, and Ruby had no idea what they were supposed to do. As far as she could see, none of the vampires had food before them. "Hey!" a cheery voice said, revealing a vampire girl standing beside Ruby who hadn't been there mere seconds ago. She had umber skin, black eyes, and even darker hair that fell in shining ringlets to her shoulders. There were caramel highlights strewn throughout the curls. The girl was beautiful. More than beautiful, she was stunning. A fact made even more apparent when she smiled a perfect white smile at them both. "You two are new." Ruby nodded. Yeah. I guess." "Cool. I'm Katrina. You guys can sit with my friends, and I." "Come on." Katrina started walking towards a long table on the end, where a group of vampires watched the girls warily. Hallie squeezed Ruby's hand, and they glanced at each other. The fear was palpable between them, like a thread of string pulling them tight together. Ruby didn't know Hallie's last name, but she knew that no matter what, Hallie was the only one she could rely on. With a steadying breath, Ruby offered an encouraging smile to her. Hallie hesitated, eyeing the table. Then they were walking toward it. When they sat across from Katrina, Ruby put herself between Hallie and a vampire boy. Since they had to release each other's hands, the girls sat pressed close together. "That's Jeremiah," Katrina said, still smiling wide and pointing to the boy beside Ruby. "Nice to meet you guys," Ruby offered. The boy, Jeremiah, gave her a gentle smile. His brown hair fell straight down his back, his arms bare to reveal round russet muscles. His face was strong, and his green eyes stronger. But when he spoke, his voice was warm. "Call me Jeremy. It's easier." Ruby nodded. An awkward silence fell between them. She let her eyes scour the room and the vampires in it. Since they'd sat down, conversation resumed, but eyes still sought the girls out. "Let them see me looking back," she thought, agitated. A shudder raced through her, and then she was shaking. It felt like, at any moment, she was going to explode. She just wanted to get this over with. Get what over? Drinking blood? Being a demon? She frowned. Suddenly, there was a small chime, and vampires dressed in light blue tunics came out of a tall door carrying cases full of what looked like large water bottles. Only something dark and thick was inside of them. Ruby swallowed hard, both in hunger and disgust, as one of the blue-tinted bottles was placed before her. "Ruby?" Hallie breathed as their waiter passed. Her face was pale, her eyes wide as she shook her head vigorously. I can't do it." Chapter 10. Ruby saw that Katrina and Jeremy were pretending not to listen. Ignoring them, she leaned close to Hallie and said softly, "You don't have to. I'm not going to force you, but—" She paused, licking her lips as her eyes continued catching on the red liquid. It seemed to glitter in the glow of the fake gas lamps on the walls. She wondered how it would feel rushing through her mouth, down her throat into her stomach, and she shook her head. "Focus. Forcing herself to look away from the bottle and meet Hallie's gaze, she went on, "But are you sure you want to die?" "I don't know," Hallie said. She slumped, defeated. All the pain, the anger that Ruby felt was projected on Hallie's face. What was it like to wake up and realize you'd been turned into a monster without your permission? She had to feel violated, furious. Ruby sighed. "Look, I'm not sure about any of this either. All I know is that I don't want to die. And," she gestured to the bottles, "we don't have to hurt anyone to live." Hallie's eyes slid to the bottle, her pink lips parting slightly as hunger crossed her gaze. For a moment, Ruby thought the girl was going to lunge for her bottle. Then, Hallie looked at her once more. "If you do it, so will I just don't want to be alone." "You won't. I promise." "Okay," she nodded. Then she grabbed her bottle and twisted off the lid. Immediately, the scent hit them. A growl rumbled through Ruby. Such a rich, heady scent. It drew her forward, but as if feeling Ruby, Hallie quickly snatched the bottle away in a fierce, predatory movement and tipped it over her mouth. Ruby froze. She watched the thick, glittering liquid fall over the girl's lips and into her mouth, heard the pleasurable sound Hallie made, and the ecstasy on her face. Ruby didn't hesitate. She didn't stop to consider the consequences or her own fear. She only acted. Twisting off her own lid, she tipped the bottle back. It was only short seconds before it touched her tongue. Then she was lost in it. She disconnected from herself, her surroundings. All there was the blood. Her body thrummed, her skin tingled. Her mind spun. She had imagined it would be coppery like a penny. That when she tasted it, all she would think about was the metal from the car digging into her gut, of the blood-soaked pavement and dead bodies. She'd been wrong. The blood was the sound of her grandmother's laughter, Lexi's off-key singing, Zurith's goofy smiles. It was sitting beside him at Cryer's Creek on a summer day when the sunlight streamed through the brilliant green to shimmer and dance on the water. It was warmth and happiness eternal. It was Mary pulling her crying form into her arms and saying, "Mija, it will all work out, I promise." She felt its warmth flooding her stomach, electrifying her nerves and crackling through her veins. She was on fire. Before she knew it, the bottle was empty. She licked her mouth, a humming noise rising through her chest. The air shimmered and wavered, going in and out of focus. Laughter rose around her. She saw Katrina and Jeremy grinning at her. Hallie was smiling too, a contented, drunken smile. Her pale lips now blood-red. Ruby lifted her hand, feeling entirely disconnected from it. She was so tingly, so numb. If she slept now, it would surely be the best sleep she'd ever had. Another sound began rising above the rest. A steady thump, thump, thump. Hallie started giggling, causing Ruby to start giggling too. She didn't know why they were laughing, didn't care. Even as Hallie's eyes rolled back and she sagged to the floor, Ruby was laughing. One of their guards lifted the girl and carried her off. The golden lamps sent sparklers shooting across Ruby's vision like little sunbursts. She was still laughing when she too fell and was lifted. Thump. Thump. Her head lolled. She watched through her increasingly dark vision as skylights passed above her. Thump. The noise was slowing, and the more it slowed, the more apart from her body she felt. Ruby released another giggle. With one final thump, all went dark. Chapter 11. No one knew what had caused the accident. Not the police, not forensics, and not the detectives. It was as if air itself had caused the car to fold in on itself and multiple kids to fly out. one flying all the way into the woods with fractured arm and a head wound. The state of the car itself looked like it should have been hit from all sides at once. No one could make sense of it. But one thing was for sure. Ruby had been there, along with another girl. Hallie Fairfield. Both of their blood was present, enough to suggest that they should have been dead. Hallie had been thrown through the windshield, and Ruby had landed mere feet from the car, not too far from the poor Sadie girl's body. Forensics discovered Ruby's blood, and chunks of tissue and intestines on a large metal chunk of the car. Neither of the girls' bodies were found. The cops searched the woods and the road up and down, in the daylight and moonlight with dogs. Nothing. Eventually, it was assumed that someone had taken off with their bodies, though it was an undeniable fact that both were dead. Mary had felt her heart shatter in ways it hadn't since she'd lost her husband. She'd had to be the one to tell Zareth. However, despite her tear-streaked face, he'd stayed calm. A storm crossing his dark eyes, he said, "What kind of monster steals dead bodies?" Then, no, as if to a thought he'd had, "No. She isn't dead." "I know she isn't." Mary's face crumpled. "Zareth, you need to accept this." "Ma, I'm not in denial. I know she's alive." "How?" He gritted his teeth. "Because I would feel it. I would know. Someone like her doesn't just die without people feeling the repercussions of it. Especially me." Mary sniffed, now conflicted. "I think it will take a lot more than a feeling to convince the cops that she's alive." "I don't need the cops," he said. Then, taking her hand in his, encompassing it the way his fathers used to, he promised her, "I will find her. Dead or alive, I will find her, and I will bring her back to us." Mary nodded. Sitting straighter, she squeezed his hand and said, "Okay. If anyone can do it, it's you." Chapter 12. Ruby didn't know who she was or where she was when she woke. At first, she couldn't open her eyes, too lost within the darkness in her mind to feel the brush of her lashes. A familiar thudding echoed in her head. Thump, thump, thump. When at last she pried open her heavy lids, her vision swirled. A smooth white ceiling. A blank space for her to gather herself. "Ruby. I am Ruby Diaz." She swallowed hard against a sand-dry throat. "I am 24, and last night. Her brows furrowed. She couldn't remember what she'd done the night before. Thump, 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 thump. She shot up in a smooth, fluid motion and took in her surroundings. She laid on a twin size, the slate-gray cover thrown over her legs. The rest of the room was small, with a dark wood desk and chair shoved into the space between the wall and the bed, and a dark brown door she assumed led to a bath. The walls were of a dark blue pinstripe wallpaper. The room was wholly unfamiliar to her. Worry pricked at her heart as she swung her legs over the edge and paused, staring now at her legs. The black knit tights she'd worn beneath her dress were entirely torn and blood-crusted. However, it wasn't the blood that caught her attention but her skin. Her legs were a warm beige and bound to display the extra-glenda attractive veins beneath her skin. It was something that, although inconvenient, was inevitable and normal to her. The legs she was staring at now were smooth and entirely clear, as if she were a porcelain doll. They were so smooth that she had to poke them to make sure they weren't glass. The skin still dipped and squished beneath her finger, but she gave herself a sharp pinch to be sure. There was barely any pain for how hard she squeezed. The two red crescents left behind faded almost instantaneously. She recoiled, suddenly very aware of the feeling of her own flesh. Something was tugging at her mind, begging and screaming for her to remember. But she couldn't. For the life of her, Ruby had no idea what was wrong with her, where she was, or what had happened the night before. Did it have something to do with why her legs were so weird? With why she felt so weird? A shudder raced through her, followed by an intense, discomfortable feeling. The feeling was a mix of both thirst and hunger, as if she hadn't drank anything or eaten for days. For a few long moments, she continued to sit there, pondering over her confusing circumstances and this new alien body of hers. When she realized she wouldn't get any answers, sitting alone in some stranger's room, she slipped off the bed. Another shiver passed through her, bones and all, as her bare feet touched the floor. The hallway made her stop dead, as a memory of strong, emotionless men dragging her and someone else through one just like this. Then more images came. The car accident, Hallie and her lying on morgue trays, the powerful man whom she'd been both terrified of and drawn to. Not a man, she remembered, a vampire. She cringed back, her chest rising and falling fast, as everything came back to her in a violent torrent. Zareth, Lexi, Rex, and Bo. The Dixie chick. The metal digging into her stomach, and the blonde vampire drinking from her and then giving her his blood. Oh my God, she breathed, doubling over herself. Why had she agreed to his offer? Would it have mattered if she hadn't? She thought of Hallie, who'd been turned without giving anyone her permission. The shimmering, dizzying haze of the night before returned, and that feeling, the strange mix of thirst and hunger, slammed into her, causing her to jerk straight and freeze. She inhaled deeply. Tentatively, she ran her tongue over her teeth. A vague pain shot through her tongue, and blood bloomed in her mouth. She had fangs. Short as kitten teeth, but sharper than her pocket knife. Her hunger and fear rose inside of her like a funnel, swirling and spinning and confusing her until she could no longer take it. Ruby began slinking down the hallway, both hating and relishing how silent she was as she went. Her feet were nothing but a breeze blowing across the runner. Where was Hallie? "I will take you to him," said a deep, unfamiliar voice behind her. Ruby whirled, the movement quick and smooth. Lethal. It was the vampire who dragged her none too kindly through the halls. She didn't say anything, too afraid to hear that her voice was also changed. She only nodded. He didn't try to grab for her, but instead walked past her. Wordlessly they went. The halls were filled with soft blue light from the towering mosaic windows. She hadn't realized until now that they'd been walking through patches of sunlight entirely unscathed. They arrived at the elaborately carved double doors with the wolf's head knocker short minutes later. Not even an entire second passed before they were called in. The guard opened the door and moved to the side to allow her to pass. He left without another word. "I'll have fresh clothes sent to you both after this." Ruby turned and found the leader in the same spot as the night before. Today he wore a black velvet tux, his unique hair styled up on top of his head. Only, today he offered her a slight smile. Hallie was there too, in the same spot she had been before, but along with them was a woman Ruby didn't recognize. She wore all black with a long flowing coat. Her expression was even more severe than the leader's. She moved cautiously to Hallie's side. Her knees were wobbly at the sight of her sort of friend. The only familiar face who also happened to be a reminder of the darkest night of each of their lives. Hallie looked just as relieved to see her. Her sun-kissed skin was richer, her hair glossier, and her eyes glittered. "I'm glad to see you both decided to complete your transformations," the leader said, drawing both of their attention. "What happened to us?" Ruby asked. "You died. Again. Again." She felt Hallie stiffen beside her. Ruby's stomach was twisting at the thought. There was nothing she could think to reply to that. She had died twice. But how? As if reading her thoughts, the leader said, "When you do a blood exchange, in order to turn, you need to be on the brink of death. Our blood can save small injuries, paper cuts, split lips, surface-level stab wounds, but it cannot heal death. Though you have to die, it is in the end what we call a fake death. Your soul doesn't truly leave your body, but everything on a molecular level begins to shut down, and at the same time, new and entirely unheard of DNA is booming into existence inside of you. When you wake, your body is in a state of limbo, hanging by a thread between death and the undead. By drinking blood, you chose between the two. The blood you'd consumed, combined with the ritual of the blood exchange, creates a chemical reaction and kills you. This time, a true death. The human you is gone, and you are reborn as a vampire. Everything down to a molecular level." Ruby peered at her hands, as if she could see into her own DNA. Her mind spun. Even her own cells were changed. What could that mean for her physical abilities? Her day-to-day life? "It will take time to adjust," he said. "That is why I have teachers." "Teachers?" Hallie asked, wary. He nodded. "Teachers. A certain number of my vampires, who train younger vampires on how to grow into their new skin. You will be trained in our history and will learn the necessary information to survive. Along with that is physical and power training." "What is power training, and why do we need physical training?" Ruby asked, incredulous. "We're vampires. Quick and deadly." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "You still need to know how to fight to protect yourself and your peers." "From what?" "That will all be explained in time. For now," he jerked his chin towards the other vampire beside him, "this is Glenda. She is our power advisor." The woman stepped forward, her thick brown hair swinging at her shoulders. "Today, you two will be tested for any powers along with any other new vampires at the Bellwright. If you have a power, then you will begin training it immediately to protect our people. If not, then you will go on with the others." Ruby and Hallie shared a glance. There was so much they didn't know. This new world was so vast, and the information they needed was seemingly endless. Seeing this look between them, Glenda added, "You most likely won't have any power, or if you do, it will be something simple. Air, water, earth, or fire. The usual." "So, magic?" Hallie asked, her brows pinched. The woman's red-glossed mouth screwed at this, and with obvious distaste she said, "Sure. Just like magic." With a sigh, she crossed the space between them and snatched up Hallie's wrist. Hallie tried to pull free, but it seemed the vampire was too strong. Unbothered, Glenda ran her hand over Hallie's whole arm. "Sometimes I can feel if a vampire has power just by a brief use of my own." She moved away from Hallie and reached for Ruby's. Ruby, being too tired to fight, allowed the creepy woman to grab her. Her purple fingernails danced over Ruby's arm in feather-light touches, and other than the woman's skin, Ruby didn't feel anything. "How does it work?" "Your power?" she asked. Glenda didn't so much as look at her as she answered, "I'm like a siren for it. My power is my song, and it lures the connection that the power creates between nature and that specific vampire from the deep dark surface of their soul." "As a human," Kaelith joined in, "you cannot access the power nature gifted you. But as a vampire, all it takes is the Bellwright and some training." Glenda mumbled. The vampire's grip started to leave her arm when she went suddenly still and grasped Ruby's arm tighter. Glenda's eyes, which had been hooded in a bored expression, fluttered over her arm as if she were reading something Ruby couldn't. Then, just as quickly as her strange reaction came on, it was gone, and she let Ruby's arm drop unceremoniously. Ruby vaguely noticed the leader's eyes boring into her as she stared at her arm, hoping to see whatever Glenda had. "Dawn will show you back to your rooms," the leader said. "Shower. I'll send someone to give you both a tour afterwards." She could tell that meant they were dismissed, as Glenda and him bent their heads in conversation that even Ruby couldn't pick out with her new hearing. However, she was confused and disoriented, and wasn't going to let him decide what pieces of information to share and what not to. "Excuse me," she said curtly. Both vampires' eyes fell on her. The leader's mouth was tight, a warning in his eyes. Swallowing, she asked, "Are we ever going to get our questions answered?" His chin rose and those eyes, brown with green, gray, and gold, watched her. Ruby didn't break his gaze. Hallie stiffened beside her, and Glenda backed a step away. He seemed like a man whose decisions were never questioned, but she couldn't feel completely lost for any longer. As if someone had dumped her in the middle of the ocean and told her to find land with no compass and only her legs to propel her. That dark chasm inside of her sighed, the air of its sweet breath sending tingles along her nerves and cold racing through her blood. She'd forgotten all about it, and now that she was officially one of the undead, it seemed to have grown ever more apparent. Would she have to live every day with this black icy hole inside of her? Was it her grief threatening to consume her, or something more? For a brief second, Ruby thought she saw its dark depths reflected back to her in the leader's eyes. But the feeling was gone before it could form. Finally, his red lips parted, and slowly he said, "It will all be explained to you today." Ruby nodded, and not daring to speak more, left the room with Hallie. Chapter 13. It turned out that Hallie's room was beside Ruby's. By the time Ruby went into the other girl's room to sit with her on her bed, she'd forgotten all about Glenda and her weird reaction to her forearm. At first, there was only a heavy silence between them. During this, Ruby noticed that Hallie's room was identical to her own. Then Hallie spoke. "You look gorgeous as one of the undead." "I was thinking the same about you," she said with a laugh. Hallie's lips gave a weak tug. "Thank you." Ruby watched as the girl picked at her nails, her gaze empty. "I'm sorry that you lost your friends," she said softly. Hallie stiffened. For a moment she was quiet, and Ruby regretted saying anything. Then with a deep sigh the girl's shoulders slumped. "Thank you. Bo wasn't really my friend. We'd met at the party, and he offered to take me and Sadie to Red Zone, so of course we agreed. He was a cute and funny guy, so why not?" She sniffed, and her watery blue eyes met Ruby's. "But you didn't just lose one, you lost 4. Ruby's heart squeezed, and it felt like the air had been knocked from her. She tore her gaze away, swallowing violently against the tears. "Yes," she said hoarsely, "I did." "You were awake. Did you see them?" "Yes." A sound between a sigh and a sob fell from Hallie. Then she was grabbing Ruby's hand roughly, a desperate gleam in her gaze. "I'm so sorry to ask this, but did you see Sadie?" Ruby nodded. "I did." She met Hallie's gaze, conveying the message she couldn't say out loud. "You don't want to know." She seemed to understand. With another airy sob, she nodded and resumed staring at her nails. The conversation didn't pick up after that. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door, and 2 girls entered, both carrying stacks of clothes. Another followed with some pairs of shoes. "Your clothes are on the way," said one of them in a thick German accent to Ruby. She squeezed Hallie's hand, saying, "I'll be back." Hallie only gave a small nod. Ruby wove through the girls, into the hall and to her own room. She just reached her bed when there was a knock at her own door, and more girls entered. "These are your training clothes," said one. Pointing to the other, she said, "And these are for everyday wear." Ruby thanked them and picked through the clothes. Someone must have peeked at their sizes while they were dead. Cringing at the idea, she continued. There seemed to be a specific dress code consisting of reds, blacks, grays, and few other colors in dark hues. A rueful smile stretched on her lips. Even in death, her style wouldn't change. One of the girls pulled out a measuring tape and began measuring Ruby's bust while asking her size for her delicates. She tried not to sigh out loud at the fact that no one had tried to peek beneath her skirt while she was out. They left, and not too long after returned with a pile of the basics: neutrals, nudes, and scarce lace. Once they were gone for good, Ruby turned the lock on her door. She wanted to shower without worrying about someone else barging in. The connected bath was small, with just enough room for a single sink, toilet, and stand-up shower. She didn't care. Turning on the water, she began the work of undressing. However, pulling off the torn and bloodied pieces of her costume was harder than she'd thought. Her throat choked with tears as she peeled the blood-crusted tights from her skin, and violent shudders raced through her as she lifted the black dress up over her head. She didn't move as she caught her gaze in the mirror. Her cheeks were tear-streaked, her lips trembling. But something had changed in her appearance. Her complexion was clear, gleaming. Despite how dirty it was, her hair was silky and glossy, falling over her shoulders in an onyx black to red cascade. She leaned closer, coming face to face with herself. Her jade eyes seemed softer, brighter, more alluring. Supple red lips lifting, Ruby saw the teeth beneath. They were white. No, whiter than white, and perfect. And like she'd guessed, her canines were sharpened to knife-like points. Only slightly longer than humans. "You're not human." The realization hit her like a brick. She reared back, watching her chest rise and fall. She was not human, she was a vampire. A demon. Monster. But leaning forward once again, and pressing her tongue against the back of her fang, Ruby wondered what was wrong with that. As a vampire, she'd be faster, stronger, and overall more beautiful. She might even have magic, though she wasn't completely sure what all of that meant. A shudder ran through her. She was more than hungry now. Swallowing hard against the burning in her stomach, her chest, her throat, Ruby stepped into the shower. She lathered her skin with the plain bar of soap until her fingers felt sticky. Then, using the tiny hotel sample bottles of conditioner and shampoo, Ruby washed her hair just as much. Even when there was no more blood swirling down the drain, her nails were scrubbing at her scalp. By the end, she stood beneath the scalding stream and closed her eyes, letting the heat relax her muscles. In this moment of quiet, she couldn't fight the memory of the car wreck, and her knees gave out beneath her. Stuffing a hand against her mouth to quiet her sobs, Ruby let herself break down. She let herself forget that she now lived in a house with complete and total strangers. Vampires. All of it would have been easier to manage if she had Zareth with her. He would have loved all of this. Being more handsome, quicker, stronger. She would have dealt with watching him flirt and touch other girls if it meant he was here. With her. Was he the reason for the black hole deep inside of her? Was it because of all of them? Had each of her friends torn some fabric of her soul with their deaths? She wasn't sure, but at this moment, sobbing on her knees in the shower stall and inhaling water, Ruby felt the chasm rising up to catch her. "No," she told it, "leave me alone." But still, it sent up its tantalizing breath to brush across her bones, to electrify her cells. Chapter 14. She wasn't sure how long she sat there. Even after her tears dried, replaced by a horrifying hollowness and the stream turned cold, Ruby couldn't move. After some time, she came back to herself and shivered beneath the cold. She pulled herself up, turned off the water, and stepped out. The jeans she chose were the darkest black and slid perfectly over her petite shape. The blouse was a stunning royal blue velvet, with black ruffled lace rising in layers from the décolletage to a mock neck. The sleeves were slightly poofed at the shoulders, slim at the arms, and billowed out in layers of the same black lace past her wrists and at her hips. It was probably the most expensive piece of clothing she'd ever touched. Eyeing herself in the mirror, Ruby was stunned into complete stillness for a moment. Her eyes weren't red or puffy like they should be after crying so hard, and dressed in this shirt, red-tipped black hair lying over her shoulders, and fangs in her smile, Ruby felt entirely comfortable with what she saw. As if this were the real her. Not the girl who had to force her eyes away from the judging gazes of her classmates. Not the girl who tried to wear what was popular in order to fit in, only to realize she wasn't meant for what was on trend at that moment. For a split second, she felt like she might be able to feel at peace here. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad to drink blood. Maybe she would find a family here. Friends. Her jaw clenched as pain shot through her chest. She didn't need new friends. Ruby had friends, and she wouldn't disrespect them by forgetting them. Tearing her stinging eyes from the mirror, Ruby laced up her slim black boots and stepped into the hall. Hallie stood just outside of her own room, leaning up against the wall and talking to Glenda. The former had chosen a simple gray mini dress that hugged her slim figure, black knit leggings, and boots that matched Ruby's. They'd each only been given black combat boots and black and white tennis shoes for training. An onyx headband lay in Hallie's blonde hair. "Ruby," Hallie sighed, slumping as if she'd been anxiously awaiting the girl's appearance. Ruby offered her a small smile. "Hey. What's going on?" "I'm to take you to feed, and then give you a tour," Glenda said flatly. She beckoned them to follow her with an easy wave of her light brown hand and began striding down the hall. Ruby's stomach had begun burning at the word feed, and she followed eagerly. When she glanced at Hallie, she saw her own hunger reflected in the girl's eyes. It was as if something sat inside her, clawing at the walls of her stomach in tantrum. It wouldn't be satisfied until she fed, and if she didn't, it would only get worse. That much she could tell. But what would happen if she never fed? She didn't voice her ponderings as they walked, her thoughts slowly getting cloudy with the feeling. It turned out that the cafeteria wasn't too far from their rooms. Only took 2 long dimly lit hallways before she saw the ballroom doors. However, when they entered, it was empty and entirely silent. "There's a specific eating schedule," Glenda said, the click of her heels echoing throughout the room. "But since new vampires are special cases, you two will eat lunch now." "Will we get a copy of this schedule?" Hallie asked. Glenda waved another hand. Yeah, of course. Sit here, I'll be back." The girls sat at the designated table and watched as Glenda disappeared through doors that waiters had appeared through only the night before. All was silent around them. "I like your shirt," Hallie said softly, smiling at her. "It's probably the nicest thing I've ever worn." Hallie huffed a laugh. "Everything here is so weird and dark." "Weird?" Ruby eyed Hallie then, watching how the girl's nude fingernails picked at her leggings. It was apparent she wasn't nearly as comfortable as Ruby. Would she ever be? Would they be able to move on and be happy? Again, Ruby's chest stung, and she had to take deep breaths to hold the tears back. She would have thought that there would be none left inside of her. But every one she held back was 10 she'd cry later. Still, she needed to keep her cool. There was absolutely no way for her to prepare herself for what came next, and she'd need to keep a level mind to face it all. Glenda returned with 2 warm bottles full of shimmering blood. Only this time she handed them 2 tall straws and said, "Drink as we walk." Slipping the white straw into the bottle, Ruby took a tentative sip, and then another, much larger drink. The blood tasted better than it had the night before. The more time had gone by, the more Ruby pieced together about the night before. She could still see the way the light danced off of the liquid. How it had tasted like ecstasy in a bottle. What would it taste like straight from the vein? "Where do you guys get the blood?" Hallie asked. Glenda sighed, "Willing donors." Hallie shot Ruby a wide-eyed look. "Willing?" "Yes. Willing." Hallie didn't say anything more, but from the bewildered look on her face, Ruby could tell she was still struggling to process the information. Ruby continued to gulp down the blood as Glenda led them around the mansion. Since it was such a large place, she only showed the girls the rooms they needed to know. There were large rooms turned into makeshift classrooms for Vampire 101, Vampire 202, and Vampire History. They passed through halls with other bedrooms similar to Hallie's and Ruby's, but there were also bigger, nicer rooms with queen or even king-size beds, canopies, and even a few balconies. When Ruby asked about them, Glenda said, "They're reserved for the vampires with powers or any high-rank visitors." Glenda pointed out towering double doors which led to a yard for combat training. Then there were rooms big enough to be considered ballrooms, turned into power training and lecture rooms. At one point in the tour, Hallie leaned over and whispered, "I did not graduate high school just to die and return to it." Ruby nodded her agreement, and Glenda shot them a narrowed glance over her shoulder. However, the twist in her lips suggested she felt similar. "And finally, this is Ballroom 3, or what we call the auditorium. This is where the bell rite will be taking place in an hour's time." They'd stopped before tall white doors with gold embellishments that led into a particularly wide room. The floor was a blue and gold mosaic of tile, with a small platform made out of ebony lacquered wood at one side. There were rows and rows of matching benches taking up the rest of the space. Aside from a podium and a bowl full of what Ruby assumed was water, the room was empty. "What happens in the bell rite?" Ruby asked. "Nothing that you need to worry yourself over." Hallie shot Ruby a look as Glenda stared at her slim black wristwatch. The vampire was infuriating. "Well, that's the end of the tour. Here, I'll take those." She snatched the empty bottles from the girl's hands, and for a moment, Ruby felt like she was a child again, and that alone angered her. Swallowing her anger, she asked, "What is the leader's name?" "Leader? The man whose office we keep being taken to," Hallie added. "Oh," Glenda waved her hand, "Kaelith?" "Kaelith." Ruby's brows pinched. She hadn't heard the name before. "What do we do now?" Hallie asked. Glenda shrugged, her eyes roaming the space they were in. It was a roundabout part of the hallway, and they were surrounded by 3 towering doors leading to different cavernous rooms. This part of the mansion had white tile floors with dark blue diamonds painted on them, and the walls were the blue of a robin's egg. Just like the rest of the house, it was lit only by the faded sunlight streaming through blue-stained glass windows and supernatural eyesight. Suddenly, the vampire straightened and became instantly still, her dark eyes tracking on something in one of the hallways behind Ruby and Hallie. In a noticeably lighter tone of voice, she said, "It seems you girls are to be granted with our sire's presence." Ruby's brows furrowed, and she turned, eyes scouring the dark hall. She heard him before she saw him. Kaelith moved as silent as a steady stream breaking around a rock. There was no way she would have heard his light steps as a human, as now she could barely make them out with focus. Then she saw his tall, lean form striding towards them. Her heart stopped. With each window he passed, the few gray streaks were lit with blue. The light cast shadows in the hollow of his cheekbones, the space beneath his jaw. He was handsome, but something about him, whether it was his power or stony features, made Ruby want to cringe into the tightest corner and pray he didn't see her. Either that, or paint his beauty. It was too late for that now, though, as he entered their small part of the circle hallway. His eyes instantly found hers. She forced herself not to cower and met his gaze. He gave her a short nod, and then to Glenda he said, "Thank you. You may go." The vampire didn't waste a second in vanishing with the barest stir of air. Ruby wasn't sure if she was supposed to bow, but she stayed on her feet. She'd met him on her knees, and she wouldn't ever lower herself again. Was he considered vampire royalty? Why did every vampire treat him like it? He nodded to Hallie before his eyes found Ruby's once more. "Walk with me," he said. It wasn't a request, and though he hadn't spoken in a demanding tone, Ruby wondered if they were free to refuse. With a quick glance at Hallie, she followed. Hallie squeezed Ruby's hand as they walked behind him. Soon, though, they realized he was waiting for them to walk with him. They quickened their steps. The walk was quiet. Hallie walked with her eyes on the floor, Kaelith with his hands in his pockets. Ruby soon understood she had to be the one to break the silence. Clearing her throat, she asked, "Did you want to speak with us?" The side of his mouth lifted slightly. "You wanted someone to answer your questions, and I thought I should be the one to do so." Hallie and Ruby shared a meaningful look. This was their chance. Chapter 15. They jumped immediately into their questions. What happens if we never feed? Do vampires have to live here? Why do we drink from bottles instead of people? What happened to the vampire that turned me? Ruby fell silent at Hallie's last question, her heart breaking for the girl. Kaelith huffed out a laugh. "I'm assuming that isn't even half of your questions." "No," Ruby said. She vaguely remembered where they were as they walked with him. Passing a window, she gazed out towards the sunset, silhouetting the trees and coloring the sky in rich oranges, pinks, and purples. But the sun itself was bright red as it descended. "I guess I should start answering them now before it gets too late," he said, a smirk on his lips. "If you never feed, your body will desiccate. It is the worst kind of torture a vampire could be put through. No, vampires don't have to live here. But we recommend it for the newly turned. We drink from bottles rather than people, because we don't want to risk any deaths on our hands." "As for the last one," he said, looking directly at Hallie. His expression grew hard. He was severely punished. "That is all I will say, but know that justice was served." Hallie nodded, fighting to keep her expression neutral. Ruby cleared her throat and drew his weighty attention to her. "Why do all of the vampires treat you like royalty?" He grinned, revealing a startling, handsome smile. "I'm not royalty, but I've worked hard to earn all of their respect." "How?" Hallie's eyes lifted from her nails at this. He took a deep breath, his gaze drawing off into the distance as he began. "Let's just say there has been a very powerful enemy determined to kill off our kind. The past leader refused to create any sort of army or protection. He was lazy. Because of this, the death rates of our kind were skyrocketing, and if it continued that way, our kind would go extinct. So, I challenged him to a duel. If there was one quality of his I could count on, it was his pride. The night came, we fought, and I came out the victor." "A duel." Ruby breathed. When the both of them looked at her, she realized her mouth was hanging open and quickly snapped it shut. Hallie shook her head, How long ago was this? Many, many decades ago, he said simply, as if it was normal. Then again, to him it was. So, Ruby started, mind spinning, you became the new leader because of the duel. Yes. It wasn't easy. There were many vampires who were too scared to do anything and tried to oppose me. But in the end, I won. That's when programs for vampires to train their powers began. Ruby was awed into silence. He went on, explaining how over the years they'd developed lines of defense to keep the enemy at bay. But Ruby couldn't keep her mind off of one thing. Are we immortal? She blurted. He appeared shocked by her outburst but only said yes and no. Boisterous laughter and conversation reached Ruby's ears long before they reached the ballroom, distracting her from his cryptic answer. She wasn't sure that was because of her vampire hearing. The sight she beheld at the doors revealed just how many new vampires there were. Almost every space on the benches was taken. She hadn't realized that they'd been walking for over an hour, nor that Kaelith had looped them back to where they'd started. Her head was still spinning with questions, but she knew she'd need to stuff them away for later. By the amount of smiles and excitement, Ruby quickly deduced that none of these kids shared the same rough transition. In fact, most of them appeared to be either still in high school or fresh out of it, excluding a man with gray hair dressed in tweed and a woman who, at a closer look, appeared to be the same age as Mary. Ruby's throat choked. This whole time, she hadn't even considered what Mary must be going through, but with what lay before her, she couldn't focus on much of anything. There's a lot, Hallie said, eyes wide and dancing from jumping teen to jumping teen. Yes. We had a successful year. Ruby side-eyed him. She wanted to ask what he was creating so many vampires for, but before she could, he offered them both a tight-lipped smile and said, "The rite is about to start." "Right," she said, "thank you." "Of course." The girls stepped further into the room tentatively. At first, only a few stray eyes would catch on them, size them up, then look away. Until more and more eyes did double, then triple takes. Ruby moved slightly closer to Hallie, perplexed by the attention when she heard someone whisper as she passed, "What's Kaelith doing here?" Brows furrowed, Ruby cast a look over her shoulder to find Kaelith standing in the back, hands in pockets, scanning the room. His eyes met hers, and he gave a slight nod. She tore her gaze away. They found a tight space in the midst of the chaos to squeeze onto the bench. People continued to look their way, but eventually the stares stopped. Hallie and Ruby didn't talk. Instead, sitting shoulder to shoulder and trying not to be jostled, they gave each other silent strength for what came next. A resounding ding rang throughout the room. Almost immediately, everyone fell silent. Hallie let out a deep sigh. As everyone shoved space for themselves on the benches, Glenda became visible, walking up the platform, carrying a large box. She didn't speak a word as she set the box on the ground and lifted a giant silver bell and prong from within. The room seemed to hold its breath as her eyes lifted to them. Her cool gaze scanned over the faces slowly, drawing the moment out. For a second, her scan hesitated, gaze slightly widening at a particular spot in the room before hurriedly resuming. Ruby didn't have to guess hard to know what Glenda had seen. Or who. Why was it such a big deal that he was here? She fought the urge to look over her shoulder and the heads behind her to catch a glimpse of his hard expression. "Okay," Glenda said sharply, her voice barely above a conversational level. "I am going to test all of you for powers." "What is a power?" "A power is a specific ability you may possess. Now, most vampires who do have one have only the basics. Either water, earth, air, or fire. no more than one. However, every now and then, there is a special case who has a power beyond just the basic elements. This, she lifted the bell, is going to reveal what power you have. If you have one. How? My power is one of the rare ones. My power is a siren song for other vampires' powers. However, my siren song isn't strong enough to identify your power, only to detect if you have any. This bell amplifies my song and brings your power bursting from you in a wild, sometimes dangerous display. She strode down the platform's steps towards the first vampire at the opposite end of the room. Grabbing his hand, she flipped the prong's round end away to reveal a knife-sharp end. Before the vampire could react, she'd already jabbed the tip of the point into his wrist. A couple drops of your blood placed onto the prong gives the song a specific target. If I were to ring the bell without the blood, it could end in no one's powers being revealed, or everyone's at once in a fatal explosion. I will go down the rows one at a time, so stand when I approach you. Otherwise, sit and be silent. At first, no one sat, but everyone was silent as they leaned forward, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the bell in action. Glenda let the boy's blood dribble onto her prong. Then, with the barest flick of her wrist and a very light tap, she rang the bell. It was the most beautiful sound Ruby had ever heard. Her eyelids fluttered, the song echoing throughout the room and vibrating in her core. It didn't last long, but it left her hungry to hear it again, and as she glanced around, a few of the other vampires held a glazed look in their eyes that surely matched her own. Throughout the short song, nothing happened, and once it ended, the boy slumped as if he'd been hoping for a different result. Glenda was unfazed, though, as she dropped his hand and reached for the girl to his side. Again, she pricked the girl's wrist roughly and rang the bell. The song hadn't danced through Ruby's bones before the hair on her shoulders was swept back by a gust of sudden wind. Gasps and shocked squeals rose through the room. The girl in Glenda's grip had her head tilted back, a look of pure ecstasy on her face as the air whipped around them. The podium on the platform rocked before crashing to the floor with a boom. Glenda removed the prong from the bell, and the girl, blinking as if coming out of a trance, looked down at her own hands as if she didn't recognize them. "Air," Glenda said dully. She pointed a narrow finger towards the towering doors and said, "Go wait out in the hall." Stunned, the girl walked her way through the people in her row and down the main aisle to the doors, pointedly avoiding all of the heavy stairs. Ruby was part of the mass watching her go, filled with the same mixture of shock and awe. How had literal air come out of her? As her eyes followed the girl, she once again caught sight of Kaelith. He didn't spare more than a glance at the girl, and continued watching the crowd and the rite as it continued with an emotionless expression. While more and more vampires came up empty of any power, Ruby would occasionally feel the weight of his gaze on her. She refused to look back. Time went by, and Glenda grew closer and closer. There was another vampire who released wind the moment the prong touched the bell. One vampire who'd sent the water in the bowl splashing, rising, and arching over the front row before it crashed back, most of it missing the bowl entirely. A boy 3 seats down from Ruby sent the temperature of the room rocketing to a blazing heat. Cries of shock and anger erupted, and suddenly everyone was breathing hard. Glenda looked around the room, watching with a slight glimmer to her eyes as everyone around her suffered, bloodied prong still touching the bell. Then, after she was satisfied, she removed it, and immediately the room cooled. Everyone sighed. The boy's face was flushed, and he looked around in embarrassment. Ruby didn't blame him, but many others did, and they showed this with scathing glares. Glenda unceremoniously wiped the prong off on her dress, flipped her hair, and continued on. She was only one person away, when Hallie suddenly squeezed Ruby's hand. The girl's eyes were wide. She was nervous. Ruby gave her a weak smile, but her own heart was racing. The idea of Glenda using her blood in some kind of ritual made her skin crawl. Though, as one of the undead, she wasn't sure her soul was in any danger now. Before she knew it, Glenda was in front of her. The vampire lifted her chin and peered at Ruby through her lashes as if she were nothing but scum. Holding Ruby's gaze, she grabbed her wrist, squeezing harder than was necessary, and stabbed her smooth flesh with the tip of the prong. Ruby didn't wince, didn't so much as hiss as she returned Glenda's glowering look. However, when the vampire ran her blood over the prong, she couldn't help but to watch. Her heart was pounding hard when Glenda lifted the prong, and as it arched down, she couldn't hear anything but the air that hissed with it. And before she could blink, the prong struck the bell, and that song, the most beautiful sound that had been slowly sending Ruby into a drunken stupor all night, sent her over the edge in an explosion of screams and darkness. Chapter 16. Ruby recoiled hard enough to fall over her bench and into the vampires behind her, all of them landing with a clattering thud. All she saw was black. A writhing, living and breathing black. It was thick, hiding her own hand from sight. People were screaming, and Hallie was calling her name. But Ruby couldn't find her. She couldn't stop this, had no idea whether this was even her doing. How could it not be? She felt it, as if it were a second skin. It seems the darkness had burst up out of the chasm deep inside of her, and was now displayed for all to see. A panic arose, and suddenly the bodies around her were jostling, shoving hard in their plight to escape this eternal night. Ruby tried to scream, but she couldn't catch enough air. Then there was a bright light, and another, and another, and another, and more small lights broke through the darkness until Ruby could see every face in the room. Everyone froze, and every face turned up to the lights. This wasn't darkness. It was night, and those weren't lights, they were stars. Her stars. A heavy silence descended over them all. There were just enough stars to cast everyone in a dim golden light. Hallie's face was pale, her eyes wide and jumping from star to star. Slowly, her gaze fell to Ruby, and despite it all, a true smile brighter than all the stars stretched on the girl's face. Glenda's own expression was one of stunned shock. She didn't even glare when she looked at Ruby, only shook her head as if she couldn't believe it. "You," she said, her voice shaking, "what are you?" "The most powerful conjurer our kind has seen in centuries." Ruby whirled. Kaelith was standing right beside her. When he turned towards her, there was a short lift to his lips, and in his eyes, pride. Hope. Something else. Whatever it was, Ruby's head spun in shock and confusion from it. He turned to Glenda, who was still staring at Ruby with a slack jaw. "I will take her from here. Please continue." At first, Glenda didn't respond, and Ruby was sure the vampire would continue to stare at her. But finally, she snapped her mouth closed and removed the prong. Ruby gasped. All her power disappeared from the room, as if it had been torn from her hands. Kaelith's palm touched her back, and Ruby was dragged back to her situation. She turned to Hallie. "I want to stay with her." His expression didn't waver. "We need to get your schedule and other arrangements set up. I'd rather wait for her. She will be safe. Time is forever of the essence. Follow me, Ruby." She swallowed hard, hearing the edge of command in his tone. Ruby had only ever had Hallie once they were turned. The idea of being apart, for however long, unsettled her. Still, there was no room for refusal with him. Throwing Hallie an apologetic glance, Ruby followed him past all of the staring eyes and whispered words towards whatever fate now awaited her. Chapter 17. Zareth didn't believe that she was dead. He couldn't. If he did, then his mind would wander down the alley of, what kind of monster steals a dead person's body? And that would drive him mad. He began his search at all of Ruby's favorite spots: the garden behind her college campus, her gym, the art galleries in the surrounding towns, and lastly, Criers Creek. He knew it was foolish, but as he raced down the hill towards the creek, he'd still hoped he'd see her on the swing, grinning down at him. When he didn't, though, he knew he'd been an idiot. The part of him that hadn't wanted to believe she was in danger had held on to the hope that he'd find her browsing the stacks at the record store or lacing up a pair of new black boots. After he finally accepted the reality of the situation, he began broadening his search. He walked through the town and through the back roads, not caring that it was trespassing when he'd creep through abandoned buildings or sneak up to houses at night to listen for the sound of her voice. He peered through basement windows, scared of what he'd see if he found her, but also too desperate to care about himself. Still no luck. "Look at Red Zone," the voice said. It had been there, in the back of his mind, ever since the night of the crash. It was the smartest way to go. But he'd used every excuse he could to avoid it. The cops had already searched there multiple times. Yeah, but does anyone else know Ruby's patterns like you? It was dangerous. And she could currently be in danger. He wasn't fully recovered yet. "You're running around town just fine." Finally, though, he knew it was the best place to look. He'd healed well enough, and Zareth knew how to defend himself. But even if he didn't, it didn't matter. It was Ruby. He didn't tell his mother where he was going, only kissed her on the forehead and said, "I'll be back, Ma. Be safe, mijo. I promise." Nothing about where he was going was safe. He'd pay for the lie, but could only hope she wouldn't pay for it. There was no looking back as he floored the truck down the road that would eventually blend into Red Zone. The night was heavy, the moon barely a sliver in the sky. His hands trembled, his breath racing as he leaned to fumble with the radio. He hadn't wanted to face the memory of that night. The white road sign felt more like a bad omen than it had ever before. The city had cleaned the fake blood off, but nothing could get rid of the menace it held. Zareth eased his foot off of the gas and turned on his brights. He wouldn't make the same stupid mistake Bo made. Bo, the idiot, had gotten himself killed, leaving Zareth alone. Without him and Rex, life felt like a harsh reality he couldn't escape. And although he wasn't very close with Lexi, he knew she had meant the world to Ruby. However, it was the loss of the latter that had completely shattered him. As if he wasn't made of steel, as he'd assumed, but glass. Zareth's grip on the wheel tightened. His eyes scoured the road, and before long, he realized he was looking for Bo's Mongoled car as some sort of marker. But it was long gone, along with all of the debris and blood. Eventually, if he didn't pull over and just get out, he'd drive right out of Red Zone. Steeling himself, Zareth pulled the truck over and off of the road. He turned it off, grabbed his flashlight, and got out. When he flicked on the beam, part of him wondered why he'd come at night. If he didn't find anything, he'd come again tomorrow afternoon when the sun was high in the sky. He walked straight into the trees, keeping his ears wide open and scouring the woods. Whenever he fell upon an abandoned barn or shelter, he didn't hesitate to creep in and search the ruins for her. As he walked, gradually growing more calm, Zareth wondered if she had escaped her captors and was at his house seeking safety. The thought made him antsy. He stopped walking, battling the urge to run back to the truck and race home or to keep searching. Eventually, he realized that if she did show up at his house, she'd have his mom and his mom would call him. So, he continued on. After a couple hours, the woods opened up to long fields. He found a few houses, some occupied and others not, but still he had no luck. It wasn't until another hour had passed that he stumbled across an underground cellar. Zareth hesitated. He could go down and explore it, but what would he do if there were people down there? What would they do? He got down to his knees and pressed his ear to the hatch. There was a steady hum of machinery and the sound of dripping water. Otherwise, he heard nothing. He hesitated only a moment more before deciding that it didn't matter if other people were down there. He'd do it for her. He grabbed for the handle. "What are you doing here?" Chapter 18. "Wait here," Kaelith said. Ruby nodded and sat in a daze in a cushioned chair just before his desk. He hadn't spoken a single word since he'd guided her out of the ballroom. His steps had been hurried, his expression a mixture of panic and excitement. Even with her vampire strength and speed, Ruby had struggled to keep up with him. Now she sat alone in his office waiting for him. She pointedly ignored the space of carpet behind her, where she'd been unceremoniously thrown after waking on a morgue tray, and then where she'd again stood just that morning. The memory of being on her knees before him made her sit straighter. A few long minutes passed before finally he entered again, along with two other vampires, a tall woman with ebony skin and flowing black curls, and a man with striking auburn hair and green eyes. They were both stunning, something Ruby was realizing was common with vampires. "Ruby," Kaelith said, gesturing to the girl, "this is Sonia and this is Eric. This is Ruby, a new addition to vampire society." They both offered a kind smile. Sonia used the moment of silence to take the seat directly beside Ruby, and Eric leaned against the desk next to Kaelith, the latter glaring at him. "Hey, so we hear you have a very unique power. That you can conjure the night sky," Eric added. Ruby glanced nervously at Kaelith, who urged her with a sharp nod. Yeah, I guess. I don't really understand it." "That's okay, with our help you will," Sonia said, smiling softly. "They will be helping you to cultivate and use your power so that you can become strong," Kaelith said. Ruby paused, her brows furrowing. She eyed Kaelith before asking, "Strong enough for what?" Eric chuckled, and Kaelith's lips tugged up. Crossing his arms, he said, "For my army." "Army?" Ruby breathed, feeling her heart drop. "An army for what?" "That is what I brought you here for. I will tell you everything you wish to know, if you can promise me that you can handle it." "Handle what?" she wanted to ask. Was he in some kind of war? If so, why did he want her part of it? She had no experience fighting, and definitely none with her newfound power. Sure, he could get her trainers to improve, but what if she didn't want to kill someone? What if she didn't want to be a weapon? "I don't want to take part in a war," she rushed out. "I don't want to kill anyone." The two vampires shared meaningful glances, but he held Ruby's gaze. She saw the wheels churning in his mind. Would he order her to leave? To be killed now that she'd openly refused him? A heavy silence filled the room. Ruby didn't fidget under his eyes. She wouldn't kill. Finally, he said, "I'm not saying you'll have to. But we are under attack. We have enemies who need, at any cost, to be defeated before they kill us. I'm not a weapon." "No," he said simply, "you're not. But you could be a valuable crew member. You'd be saving more lives than you're taking if it comes to that." But you know it will come to that, don't you? Sonia inhaled sharply at Ruby's tone, the blatant irritation. Ruby ignored it. He could talk around the truth all he wanted. He lifted his chin. Motioning for Sonia to stay quiet with his hand, he leaned forward on the desk and said gravely, "Yes, I do. It will. There will be many deaths on both sides. The innocents inside of this mansion and more elsewhere will be slaughtered, and for what? Because our enemy wishes to have our power for themselves. If you join, you won't just level the playing field, you will give us the advantage. Without you, we could be as good as dead." "So," he said, walking around to lean back on his desk and shrugging, "the only options you have are to walk away and leave thousands of innocents in danger, or to join us." Ruby shot up from her chair, and the motion brought them closer than comfortable. Sonia and Eric moved to the ready, waiting for Ruby to so much as breathe wrong around their master. She released a sharp, furious breath. "How can you put me in this position? I just watched all of my friends die, and am now learning how to be a completely different species that I'd never known existed. I've seen enough death, and more than enough blood. I'll be damned if another's death is on my hands. Who do you think killed your friends?" His words, spoken so plainly, so void of any emotion, knocked her back a step. Her breath whooshed out of her, and Ruby couldn't speak, couldn't think of anything in response to what he'd revealed. But he was waiting for her to answer him. She fumbled over her trembling lips and said the only thing she could, "What?" "The lesser vampires I'm wanting you to join me in fighting against are the ones who crashed the car and destroyed it. They caused your friends' deaths. Those who didn't die on impact were killed by them. You and Hallie were supposed to die too, but for some reason you didn't." "No," she said, shaking her head sharply, "no. We must have hit a wall or something. But there was no one else there." He arched his brow. "Did you actually see what you hit?" She swallowed all of the arguments down deep into herself and thought about what she'd seen. Nothing. It all had been a blur. She'd seen Zareth standing up, had seen Hallie open her mouth to scream, and then she woke with a piece of metal in her gut. What had Hallie seen? Seeing the truth on her face, he said, "You never would have seen them coming. They know how to stay invisible. We've been searching for them for centuries. They're called the shadows for a reason." "But why?" she asked weakly. All of the fight disappeared from her, and she slumped back into her chair, causing the other vampires to release sighs. Normally, it would be to perform dark rituals, or what high vampire society knows as black rituals. It seems they killed your friends and collected their blood for some of their rituals. These rituals give them power, but are highly dangerous to the victim whose blood is used. "A ritual," she breathed, her fists curled. He gave a sharp nod. "I can't tell you what kind of ritual their blood was used in, but if it was used in the one I'm thinking of, then your friends' souls may have been doomed to hell." The air whooshed out of her. There was a pounding in her head, steadily growing louder with the fire in her chest. "So you see," he continued, "it is imperative that we have your help to stop this from happening to anyone else." Ruby's nails dug painfully into the leather of the chair. These people, whoever they are, murdered her best friends. Lexi, Rex, Bo, Zareth. People she'd cared for, even loved. They were taken away from her, and for what? Greed. "It's disgusting," she thought, fuming. "I'm going to kill them all." She had made the argument of not wanting anyone's blood on her hands only moments before, but now she was itching for it. The chasm inside of her swelled, and she would have fallen in right then and there, if not for the small poke of sanity she had. What would she do then? Hunt down an enemy who couldn't be found? No. She needed to plan. When she got her revenge, she'd hit them where it hurt most. For her friends. For Zareth. Heat burst through her, and the shadow inside the chasm stirred. She raised her gaze to his, and slowly debedding her nails from his chair said, "I will join. But only if, when we find the ones who killed my friends, we make them suffer." The air in the room tensed at her words, but triumph goldened Kaelith's eyes, and with a tilt to his sensual lips, he gave a short nod, "By your command." Chapter 19. The rest of the time Ruby spent in his office was filled with schedule arrangements, and her exploring aimlessly, as he and the others talked just out of earshot. Then Sonia was leading her out of the office and down familiar hallways. Except she wasn't leading Ruby back to her room, nor to the ballroom where the rite had been held. Unsure and drained, Ruby held her tongue. Soon they reached a short pair of brown wood double doors in a dimly lit hallway. Painted roses crowded onto white wallpaper, and a single chandelier hung not too far before the doors they stood in front of. There were other doors similar to these down further in the hall, but this one stood alone, solitary, and Ruby knew exactly what was behind each one. So when Sonia opened the doors, it was no shock to see a luxurious suite. Ruby's breath caught. These are the suites reserved for vampires with a power. She was one of those vampires now, and one of the most powerful. But this couldn't be her room. As if hearing her thoughts, Sonia turned to her, and with a bright smile announced, "Welcome to your new room." Ruby's mouth dropped. She took in the room, seeing it from a new light now that she wasn't just a visitor. The queen-size bed, with a red brocade duvet and a black lace canopy. A vanity, a seating area furnished in red and polished oak. A television, a master bath, and a walk-in closet. A sound between a giggle and a hiccup escaped her, and she quickly unlaced her boots and sunk her feet into the carpet. Then with a running start, Ruby leapt onto the bed with a gasp. The mattress hugged her, the duvet as smooth as silk. And maybe it was silk. She wouldn't know. "Well," Sonia said with a laugh, "I'll have the maids bring up your stuff." She would have nodded and fallen asleep right then and there, but she shot upright. "Wait!" Sonia turned back from where she'd been facing the doorway, brows raised. "What about Hallie?" "What about Hallie? Does she have power too? Will she be staying in one of these rooms?" Sonia shrugged her shoulders. "I have no idea. But," she added at Ruby's fallen expression, "I can find out and let you know. Please." The vampire bobbed her chin, and with that she left, and Ruby collapsed back onto her new bed. She'd never had one so comfortable, or that smelled of the flowers brocaded onto it. She stared up through the canopy, and in the silence her smile faded, and the chasm, along with her pain, became abundantly clear. Ruby stood from the bed and padded across the room, running her fingers along the red wallpaper. The carpet was soft and white beneath her feet. She fiddled with the TV remote, explored her massive closet, laid down in her tub, which was big enough to fit probably 3 of her. She did whatever she could to distract herself, but ultimately, she ended up sliding to the floor and staring blankly across the room. The sounds of the car crash rang in her head. Her chest hurt, as if the metal from the car had left a piece of itself inside of her, twisting deeper into her organs the more she tried to forget what happened. There was no way to escape it. Ruby saw their bodies, their blood. She heard their screams and the horrifying twisting of the car. What kind of people could do that? Were they vampires too, or something else entirely? Her nose stung, and soon tears were streaming down her face. She thanked everything in the world, every religion, every grain of sand, that she hadn't seen Zareth's dead body. That image she never would have recovered from. Who was she kidding herself? She will never recover from the things she already saw, and the mere fact that Zareth was dead would forever keep digging deeper and deeper into her until it reached the chasm of her soul and sucked her down into her own darkness. Ruby didn't move from her spot on the carpet as she cried. Even when the tears turned to a numb, dull ache, she stayed. It wasn't until she caught the sound of someone approaching her room that she forced herself to stand. Sonia arrived to lead her to the cafeteria, all the while talking to her about the right. There was one other vampire like you who had ice as his power. Your friend ended up having the air element. That's a tricky one. How? How did she have it? I don't know. It's just like being born with O-negative blood or blonde hair. It's a natural part of you. No, Ruby said, shaking her head. I mean, how is it tricky? Sonia huffed a laugh. Oh. Well, because air is a strong force of nature itself. Wind is what pushes water forward, to form or break land. It either smothers or ignites flame, and it can feed or drown the earth. To control wind is to control the biggest part of nature itself. But doesn't the power just come from inside of her? No. No power does. Your power is your gift from nature. Every time you use it, you take from nature. Hallie will be stealing air from around us. You will be stealing pieces of the night sky above us. Ruby's brows furrowed. She'd been sure the power had come from that chasm inside of her. The darkness inside of her was the same as the darkness between the stars. Endless and so lonely. But Sonia claims it come from outside of her. If that's true, can she control the moon too? Carve it into a scythe to fight her enemies with. She didn't get the chance to ask anything else as they arrived at the ballroom and went separate ways. Ruby quickly found Hallie at the same table from night before and hurried over to her. Ruby, Hallie sighed, stiff posture slumping. She grabbed for Ruby's hands. Where were you? All anyone's been talking about is what you did. Ruby slid close to the girl, suddenly feeling more exhausted than she ever had before. I was in Kaelith's office. He asked me to join his army. Army. Hallie's brows furrowed. As quickly as possible, Ruby explained it all to Hallie, including how this supposed enemy killed their friends. By the end, the girl's grip on Ruby became crushing, her eyes alight with fury. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a question, but rather statement full of pure anger. They'd caught Jeremy and Kat's interest now, and the boy turned to Ruby and asked, You mean the shadows? Shadows. Kat nodded gravely. They are lesser vampires. Doomed to darkness. They kill humans and vampires alike, and use their blood for black rituals. Ruby's heart dropped, her stomach churning. Black rituals, she echoed. This new world she'd been thrust into continued to get darker and darker. What would happen next? Would she be asked to sacrifice a virgin, an animal? Bile rose to her throat. Just then, the waiters entered and passed out their bottles. Ruby took deep, aching gulps of the beautiful liquid and successfully cleared her mind. It seemed that every time she drank the blood, that it took hold of all of her attention, electrifying her very DNA. Kat and Jeremy kept up a small conversation, casually sipping their drinks. Hallie and Ruby stayed quiet. Even when they'd finished, bodies warm and flush and heads tingly, they sat side by side in silence. The quiet between them wasn't awkward. Instead, it made Ruby confident of the fact that she wasn't alone. No matter what happened, she wouldn't be left to deal with it on her own. Have you switched rooms? Ruby asked, as the two of them walked through the halls. Hallie gave her a small smile that was nowhere near the one the girl had given her during the rite. Yeah. It's really big. Cool. Silence fell again. But then, Hallie looked back up from her fiddling hands and asked, "Do you want to see it?" Ruby smiled then, truly smiled, and said, "Of course." Hallie's room ended up being the door closest to Ruby's, though still a good distance away. It had blue brocade, and despite a different arrangement, was the exact same as Ruby's. Then they went to Ruby's, and found her clothes now in her closet. Hallie riffled through the clothes as Ruby leaned against the wall, watching her progress. "Do you think Kaelith lives in this area of the mansion?" Hallie asked. Ruby shook her head. "I doubt it." Then she thought back to the black curtain he'd disappeared through in his office. But it might be connected to his office. "Really? How do you know?" She shrugged. "It's a guess." "Wow," Hallie said in a tone that suggested she'd moved on to another subject entirely, as she eyed a simple dark red dress. "You have better clothes than me." Ruby moved beside her, taking in the leather with furrowed brows. "Where would I even wear this?" Hallie shrugged, still staring at it with longing. A grin tugged at Ruby's lips. Taking the dress off of the hanger, she handed it to the girl. "Here, take it." "Wait, really? Are you sure?" "Of course. It's only a dress." Hallie bit her lip, bouncing slightly on her heels. "Well, consider it a trade." No. You don't have to." "I want to," she said seriously. She leveled her gaze on Ruby. "I know it's only been a day, but already you've done a lot for me. Because of you, I don't feel so alone." Ruby swallowed hard and blinked against the sting in her eyes. "I was thinking the same thing." Hallie smiled, a single tear falling down her cheek. With a mirthless laugh she scrubbed it away. "When will I stop crying?" She sniffed. They both stared at the dress, thoughts a million miles away. After a few moments she grabbed Ruby's wrists and said, "I won't take no for an answer. Come pick something out from my closet." Laughter bubbled out of Ruby as she let Hallie pull her through the hall to her bedroom and into her closet. After minutes of searching and assuring Hallie that she didn't need to do this while Hallie adamantly disagreed, Ruby settled on a dress of her own. She realized then how many formal dresses and tuxedos they both had, and wondered what they could possibly need them for. Soon, they were rushing back and forth from each other's closets to take items of their own. Their cheeks were warm with giggles, their steps light as they ran. Ruby's arms were stuffed full when she finally stumbled into her room alone, a dizzy smile on her face. She took the time to hang each piece up, humming a dancing tune while avoiding any eye contact with her new bed. But when there was no more clothes to put away, and her eyes were drooping, she couldn't fight it anymore. The smile fell from her face. Numbly, she flipped off her lights, slid beneath the covers, and closed her eyes, hoping that tomorrow would be better. Even if infinite's Molly. Chapter 20. Zareth slowly got to his feet, preparing himself as he faced the person. The man who'd spoken wore a black cloak that covered most of his features. But what Zareth could see was utterly pale, as if the man hadn't seen the sun in years. Something dark stirred in Zareth's gut. He could feel that there was something utterly wrong with the man. Evil. He took a step back. If the man was dabbling in the darkness of this world, Zareth wanted nothing to do with it. "I apologize. I'm looking for someone." The man's bloodless lips stretched in a sickening grin. "Who?" "The night conjurer." "Run," the voice urged, "run now." "Please forgive me, but I should get going." He had no idea what the man meant, but he didn't want to be here any longer. "You aren't leaving." Zareth's blood froze. "Oh yeah. And why is that?" "Because," the man cooed, "you know her." It clicked then. This man knew Ruby. "What did you do to her? Where is she?" The man shook his head. "I do not have your girl." Not yet. But you could be of use. I will not take you anywhere near her. His smile deepened, and Zareth knew he'd made a mistake then. That's not what I want. The air stirred, and the man was suddenly in front of him. His pale hand snatched Zareth's throat, yanking him forward. Before Zareth could react, the man's mouth was on his neck. Zareth cried out as pain pierced the skin like white-hot fire. He fought against his holder's grip, but there was no budging stone. His knees buckled beneath him. He couldn't understand what was happening. Only that this man was death. To be continued. Did you love dark blood, dark vampire romance? Then you should read King of Shadows and Fire, dark fantasy romance by Blake Frost. Lilith, beloved as the kindest princess across the kingdoms, was the radiant heart of a once glorious realm. At 22, her bright spirit and boundless compassion won her the admiration of all, her kindness matched only by her courage. But her generosity would be her undoing. In a cruel twist of fate, it led her into the grasp of a merciless beast, a creature far beyond human. Ragnar, a king no one had ever seen but was feared by the whole world. He lurked in the shadows of the night and feasted on his enemies. He was known as the cruelest king, and on one fortunate night he came across someone so opposite to his world. He was intrigued and obsessed with her. Fascinated by her purity, obsessed with her light, Ragnar will stop at nothing to claim her, to make her his. He yearns to possess her, claim her, and captivate her in every possible way he can, because little Lilith belongs to him.